about 11% in the last month, which if you look at the savings from that last discussion in conservation in the state of California, adds to an already existing 16% reduction in use in the urban sector and represents a pretty remarkable shift for Californians in their consciousness, if you will, around their water usage, both in their daily habits, but in their landscapes, but also at the watershed level, where we know as we've had to respond to incredible drought circumstances this last year, 2 years, communities have, in some cases, saved up to 40, 50% because they've had a day zero. I'm thinking of the Russian River mainly there as well. And so just an honor to be able to introduce this panel. And I think we'll kick it off first to Nefertari Cooley to further introduce our panelists. And thank you, because it has been, your leadership has been such an incredible part of the shift that we've seen in our ability to kind of translate up all the real technical work that goes on the conservation space and do it in a way that's really connecting with Californians. So thank you. It means a lot to have you kick off this panel.
Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone.
There we go. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be able to kick you off on day 2 of WQCC. As I was reflecting on yesterday, sure, we had the water supply strategy as an overarching theme, but another theme that really came through really strongly was coordination, collaboration, and partnership. And so today with our presentation, that's exactly what you're going to see, a continuation of that, because the work that we've been doing around drought and around conservation really takes us being able to work with others and share ideas with each other and adapt really on the fly. So the way we're going to do this, we're quite ambitious with what we're trying to do with our 30 minutes. So speaking of adapting, we may have to adapt a bit. But Rebecca Nicholas, who is in the green to my far right, and Margaret Moore here are going to start off talking about the state's Save Our Water campaign. Rebecca is with Fiona Hutton and Associates. She's a great partner on this, and Margaret leads communications for the Department of Water Resources. And then we're going to kick it off to James, who's our Director of Office of Research Planning and Performance, and he's going to talk about some of the specific actions that the state and the water boards have taken in particular. If there's time, I'm going to chime in with some key messaging in terms of our evolution over time and how we've had to adjust our messaging based on where we are and meeting people where they are. And then Jackie Carpenter, our Media Relations Director, is going to talk about media and how that all plays into this. So with that, I will hand it over to Margaret.
Good morning, and I will be quick. How about that? And then we can answer, and have a Q&A afterwards, right?
At the very end, after we all speak, we'll do the Q&A.
All right. I just want to speak to partnerships and collaborations real quick, because Nefertari and I are like connected at the hip when it comes to communications, and it's really important to do that. I'm fairly new at the department, and it's really been helpful. So thank you for having me here this morning. So we're going to talk a little bit about Save Our Water, and Save Our Water started in 2009, and it was with Aqua, and they were the ones who led it with DWR. And then in 2020, it was rebranded and re-enhanced. And that was the start of obviously the next dry period that we're continuing to have. So now we are in phases. So the phase 1 was to really basically talk to people about that there is a drought. And that was in July 2021, to let them know that there's things you can do and that we're in a drought. And now we're into phase 2, which is like, we need to know that this drought is consistent. It's not going away. It needs to be a sense of urgency, and that this is the impact of what's going on with our hotter and drier climate is why we need to conserve. So the phase 3 is where we're going into next with in January. We're right now in a bridge, and the phase 3 is we need to drive long-term change. So those are objectives for the campaign. So in phase 1, we have been doing research that has been guiding our strategy throughout all the phases. And we continually do tracking and focus groups to let us know how we're doing and what people are thinking. And in July 2021, drought was not top of mind. There was other things that were, a lot of other things, and it was very, very clear. And we knew that we need to create some, continuing messages around that. Next slide. Next slide, please. Sorry, I didn't say that. Anything you want to add to that?
I think the important thing on this slide is that, we conducted a couple rounds of research, and one of the things that we found here is that the preferred messengers really are local water managers and scientists, far and above over politicians and government officials, and that has really driven a lot of our local, hyper regional outreach approach. And I think the other thing that was interesting find for us, as we all know, there's a lot of crisis fatigue out there. The awareness of drought and the desire to even do much more of anything has slipped, and folks are really viewing water supply challenges pretty far down on the list of things that are impacting them. They're focused on homelessness in their pocketbooks and inflation. So I think we came into this knowing that we had a lot of awareness and sort of targeted education to conduct.
So then we moved into February 2022, and as you know, we had an atmospheric river in October and an unbelievable snow pack above average in December. And then we went into January and February with the driest, January, February, March, the driest period in 100 years. Well, come February, drought was not on everybody's mind because they thought, oh, we have plenty of water because it's cyclical again. So that meant March had a horrible conservation number. I think, what was it? Up 17% use. It was just awful. So we knew that we needed to create some, next slide, please. Sense of urgency. So here we started doing Save Our Water, talking about California's water supply and extreme drought, and created that sense that, really this is dire. So then next slide, please. We're in phase 2, where we're talking about our new climate reality and how important conservation is. So in May, drought was still not top of mind with people. So that's why we wanted to hit we looked at the high use urban area zip codes and disadvantaged area zip codes that were still using water at a higher rate. And we tried to focus on tips on how you could do water conservation quickly and immediately, indoors and outdoors. And then we started talking about outdoor water use and doing some research on that. And we found that the term turf was very confusing. They thought it was artificial and it was for soccer fields and football fields, not for homes. Well, that we know now is not how we want to talk about yard transformation. We don't want to call it turf replacement. That's just an FYI. So then coming in August, we did another research study, and it is a little bit more, what would you say, Rebecca? It's encouraging that people do believe that there is a climate change going on, and that we are in a hotter and drier environment as we speak. Go ahead and next slide, please. So this is some of our, next slide, please. This is some of our creative that was in phase 2 that was really focusing on the extreme drought and also tips to things that you can do easily. One of the things that really helped motivate people was the Caltrans signs during the holidays. I don't know if everybody saw it or saw those, but we know that we got some earned media around that. People commented on it. It also created a sense of urgency. One of the things we found out in our research is that people don't have that sense of urgency because it's not mandated right now. That they don't, if it's not mandated conservation, they think, okay, it must not be that bad. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
I would say in terms of the mandates themselves, I think there's this expectation that, okay, if the state of California is mandating conservation, this must be real. And because we went to this sort of local drought contingency planning where everything's different, each region is approaching it differently and has different needs, that has been a real focus of ours to get into, like I said, local communities where they're doing things differently, and making sure that our messaging and our support from the campaign side is really reflective of those nuances, those local nuances.
Next slide, please. So now we're in the phase 3 of our long-term behavior changes, which we're calling it, because we have seen that now people 50-50 think that it's cyclical and the other 50-50 think that it's permanent. But we need to start messaging the fact that this is a long-term water conservation effort. It's a lifestyle change. This is, something that we need to do continually in California's new climate reality. So we have found that in our last October focus group that people are aware that there's a changing climate, that they still feel the lack of urgency because it's not mandated, that conserving water is a way of life and they're already doing that, but they're not really because we are only at 11%. And that the big thing and the big takeaway is that people think that businesses and cities and municipalities aren't doing enough and that the residents are the only ones being asked to conserve because they don't know what whether conservation efforts are out there. So that's sort of where we're at right now. And I'll go ahead and see if
Just one more add to that. In our focus groups, I think what was really interesting and encouraging and fits with the theme of today's panel is that there was a real sense of shared responsibility and messages about us all in this together, tackling these difficult problems as sort of one state really resonated well. And that was really encouraging for us. So we took away from that, there is a real strong understanding of where we're at in California in terms of climate realities. And then altruism, the desire to do the right thing for the community and your kids really, really plays well across the state and has been helpful in our messaging and creative.
Next slide, please. So our next phase is that further shift in perception away from drought, and it's a year-round hotter, drier climate, and that we want to increase awareness of water-saving measures and especially yard transformation. So as you see, we're changing that terminology. Next slide, please. And the last I just want to bring up is, and then because we're running out of time, is that local engagement is extremely important. So we're working in partnerships with the local water agencies on a regular basis. We have regular meetings every other week. We also are doing events. This is what Fiona Hutton Associates is helping to do across the state, is connect the water agencies with our water conservation message and their Save Our Water campaign. So we'll take questions after everything's done. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'll continue on that theme of this sort of dichotomy or split between like crisis response versus water conservation as a way of life. And that's kind of been playing out at the policy level. Next slide, please. So this is a little hard to see, but the green spikes are wet periods over time. This chart starts in 1970, and the orange spikes going down are dry periods. We've got a number of policies that have happened over time. It is an interesting sort of coevolution, I guess, between policy and the climate change, the drought, where we see a lot of innovations in water policy happening during dry periods. And then, some of that progress is maintained and sustained over time. Some of that sort of goes away because it was perceived as like emergency crisis response. And now I'm going to talk a little bit more about this previous drought, or the beginning of our current drought, current long drought. And that's actually, I think, another messaging point is like, I think a lot of people think of drought as something temporary, something that will be over soon, something if they ignore for a year, it will go away. And I think, that may still be true, but we're also seeing this longer term trend toward aridification. And it may be, when we say things like this is the driest 3-month period in 100 years, or the Southwest is in a drought that it hasn't been this bad in over 1,000 years, like I think we may be getting through to people that this is more than just like a little blip. Next slide, please. So in the prior drought, back in 2014, the State Water Board put emergency regulations into effect, and it required urban water suppliers to report their monthly water production, per capita water use, things like that. And we used that information to assess statewide production and use levels and conservation. In 2016, Governor Brown issued an executive order to make water conservation a California way of life. Again, this speaks to getting away from kind of crisis response and crisis fatigue, and more to sort of just permanent shift. And so emergency regulations at that point set minimum levels of activities that residents, businesses, and water suppliers should be meeting as the drought continued. Those emergency regulations, each was in effect for a year. Some got renewed, but those all ended at the end of the drought. And the legislature sort of picked up the momentum at that point, passing two bills, collectively the Making Water Conservation a California Way of Life package, which the board then used to make that reporting, the monthly reporting of water use to the board from suppliers, mandatory. It had been voluntary for a little while there. And then since then, the Governor Newsom, has called for urban conservation of 15% compared to 2020 levels. And the state board has done a couple of actions to help achieve that. So next slide, please. So here in this valley figure shows at the far left that at the beginning, when the governor made that call for a 15% reduction compared with 2020 levels, we were still actually pretty close to 2020 levels. Water use statewide was just 2% below 2020 levels. It wasn't low enough. The weather then kind of worked in our favor. In October and December, it was really wet, and so water use dropped. But then we had extreme heat, and water use went up again compared with the 2020 levels. And then there's kind of an inflection point in sort of the June timeframe where we think our two emergency regulations, actions by Metropolitan, the messaging campaigns, sort of began to cumulatively have an effect. And now we're at about 10% savings compared with 2020 levels, which is pretty good. But more is still needed. And that's why we're continuing to work on emergency regulations potentially. Next slide, please. In the water supply strategy, the governor said that if drought conditions persist, the board should consider new short-term requirements that could take effect next spring. Simultaneously, we're working on this longer-term Making Water Conservation a California Way of Life framework that is also kicking in very soon and will sort of be, in full effect around 2030. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, James. Time flies when we're up here. So I'm just going to sort of summarize a few points that touch on what already has been shared, but also go a little further with that. So the first thing I want to say is that, as I indicated earlier, this really has been about meeting people where they are in that moment. And to do that means being in touch with where they are. So in addition to the Save Our Water campaign and the insights that we now have from that, social media has been another place where our team has been able to listen and learn. So for example, at the very beginning, when we put out a notice to water right holders, about 40,000 water right holders in March 2021, we knew that right then we had to start building awareness because, of course, you can't get to the behavioral changes that you're asking for if people are not only not aware, but not accepting of what it is that you're trying to get across to them. And we fortunately really have seen that evolve. Every time we have a policy decision that gets made, a regulation that gets passed, it becomes another opportunity for us to really leverage that piece, whether it be in the media or on our website, and talking points for our colleagues and board members that are going out doing events through the various channels to really communicate about where the state is in terms of hydrology and in terms of how people are responding to messages. But also we have to keep that drumbeat going on a regular basis. I would say that our team, we're a small but mighty team. We don't necessarily have a budget for this, so we've been scrappy. And the way that we do that is just by leveraging every opportunity that we have to get messages out and, again, to hear what it is that is resonating with people as well as what's not resonating with people. And some of that, I have to say, comes from intuition. So January, when we passed our emergency regulations for conservation on prohibited uses, turf was a thing, right? It was a conversation that we had, and we thought, people don't say that. They say grass or they say lawn. And so it's great to have the insights from the campaign, though, then coming back and affirming that decision. But at the end of the day, when it's go time, it's go time. And so we continue to just move out and then, come back and confirm as we can. And then The other thing that strikes me as we think about sort of the evolution of messaging over time is James pointed out, well, first we started with dry year. We were avoiding the D word drought, and then we started talking about drought. But then again, it was trying to help people understand we're not talking about just one point in time necessarily. We really do need behaviors to change over the long term. And so now where we've evolved, we started talking about climate change, and now we're talking about extreme weather and, of course, hotter and drier climate. So again, that ties into being in touch with where people are. It probably would have been too much for people for us to give them that last year, but we're at a place now where it's really important for them to understand the reality of our state and how they can be a part of that shared responsibility. So given the time that we have, I'm now going to turn it over to Jackie, who's going to talk with you about the media components of this.
Okay. Thanks, Nefertari. And I'm just going to run through a few things pretty quickly so we have at least a few minutes for questions. So I wanted to just talk about how the media has been a partner with us in getting this conservation message out, because it has been. And so why do I say that? So I just want to take a quick trip back to July of 2021. I know it feels like a long time ago already, but that was when the governor first made the call for 15% of voluntary conservation. And at that point, as our Save Our Water campaign was just saying, there people had crisis fatigue. There was a sense that the drought was something that was a Northern California problem because that's where the drought proclamations had been at that point. Southern California had really not woken up to the fact that there was a drought. So from the media's point of view, at that point, when there was a 15% call, and then we followed that up with our reporting at our monthly board meetings of where we were at in terms of our urban retail water supplier reports, it presented the media with this opportunity to really have enough information to report about this in a way that could track on what the state was doing. And the media did that. And they really did that in September of 2021, which was the first time they had the data since the governor had made that voluntary call for conservation. And we were really inundated with media queries from everybody. It was the story of the moment. And the media really helped pierce the veil, especially in Southern California at that point, because again, Southern California had not really been on board with this idea that we were, in a drought. And at that point, the Los Angeles Times article, the LA Times ran an editorial that said, yes, Southern California, we have a water shortage emergency too. And that was really kind of the first milestone I wanted to point to that the media helped us get to, which was that, recognition that, yes, the state has an emergency that we need to be addressing, and we need to be addressing it through conservation. If you can just go to the next slide, please. So one way that happened was that reporters, because we were putting out this incredibly rich data every month about what was happening across the state, what was happening with the different water suppliers, reporters were able to dig into that and actually kind of build roots into their conservation coverage in terms of what was happening in there locally with water conservation, what was happening locally with water use. And you saw over the months since when we started, over the months, you saw more local reporting about, how is water being used locally and why is it being used that way? And even questioning of local policy decisions. I have a piece up there specifically from the Desert Sun doing just that. So it became, the media helped make conservation not just a story that was every month when the numbers came out, but became more of like a fabric of reporting about how are we going about things and questioning how we're going about things locally, and also talking about conservation more regularly. We can go to the next slide, please. So at the second point, the second sort of milestone point I want to point to is the beginning of this year when we had that record-shattering dryness for 3 months. And we saw a U-turn in the conservation numbers. We were doing okay through December. And then all of a sudden we had, as was mentioned, we had 17% or something in March, demonstrating that there had been a real U-turn. At that point, I wasn't really sure, is the media going to start reporting kind of like a blame game, like, Southern California, you're doing so badly, or, this pointing of fingers through the numbers that we were putting out. But that isn't what happened. And actually, it had a lot to do with trying to manage that media understanding of what was going on. There were meteorological briefings that were given and arranged by agency to try to explain the nexus between weather outdoor water use and conservation. And I feel like that messaging really helped the media understand why we were seeing such high water use at this time of year, and also to understand that this isn't just about turning on the sprinklers or not. This is about operating inside of a changed climate, and that helped build the case for in my view, that helped build the case for the emergency orders, conservation regulations that came about first in January and then in May, and then were followed up with restrictions locally. I'm thinking specifically down in Southern California, actual restrictions that happened. The media helped build the case for that through understanding the nexus between weather, water use, and conservation. And in my view, we haven't seen, at least in the media, there hasn't been this sense that there's resistance to those restrictions. There seems to be a general understanding at the public level that they're necessary. And so I think the media helped us get there. And, as Joaquin mentioned, we have 11% now. I think the media helped us. The media was a partner in getting there. And sometimes it was messy. And sometimes there's definitely questioning of policy decisions and all those sorts of things that goes into it. But ultimately, in terms of what we can leverage to really build public understanding and awareness, the media is a very, very important partner. So thank you.
All right, I know we just have a couple of minutes left, but are there questions for the panel?
Jim Stahl, and first, thank you. Incredible panel and dense and just rich information around a really critical topic in the state. So thank you for covering that so well. I'm just going to look over to Meredith and see, we can keep having questions until the secretary kind of arrives. So just flag that, and then we'll just keep having questions from there. I think to note that information, the data component, really having open information and data, the conservation portal that, to your point, allowed things to be translated was part of that success. And Jim Stahl asked and says, knowledge is powerful. Is there consideration to providing a chip or online water meter link for the homeowner? And I can take a stab at that only because one of my hobby horses is some of this space. There's a lot of advanced metering infrastructure that's been put into place by some of the larger agencies particularly. And what that is just real-time data from a water meter at a home. I know Eric often brings up, even here in Folsom, there are advanced metering in place. What it allows for is a portal for a homeowner to have to see, is there a leak? Alerts can be provided very quickly instead of waiting a month. And sometimes, and for some agencies who have older meters and only read maybe every couple of months, you might not know you have a leak for a month or two. And a month or two worth of a leak is a lot of water. And so there is that going on, Jim. It's not, we're looking, I think, on the state side to support it more with funding, but it's something that it is definitely out there. There's Flume out there as a device that many households can purchase independent of necessarily an investment from their water agency on individual water use. But it's fun. It becomes like so much of this work, not unlike our data portal on system level conservation. That information becomes a basis for discussion, becomes a basis for understanding, becomes a basis for connecting neurons in your brain around how you're using your water in a way that is actually fun. You can somewhat gamify, if you will, the way the data is coming in and trying to keep driving down your conservation numbers and figuring out how you value at your household level this incredible resource we have. Okay, I'll stop. So yes, thank you, Jim, for the good question. Please do remember, and I forgot to say at the top, the QR codes here allow you to put in any written questions, and we can also take them verbally.
Thank you for your informative panel. Given how many languages we speak in California, could you suggest a particularly effective strategy for reaching a non-English speaking set of households?
With the Save Our Water campaign, we translate everything into Spanish, and we focus and have a we have an advertising agency that we have focused language for all the Asian languages, as well as I think there's like 12 or 13 that we find that are their primary languages. We don't translate everything into that, but what we do is we call it multicultural our omnicultural focus, where you take a look at your message and you vet it through the agency of that cultural agency to see if this is something that resonates or doesn't resonate, and if you need to change the messaging so that it does resonate to that culture. So we feel like that's the best way. This is our paid media campaign to reach the different communities, because the different communities just we can go through a whole litany of things we found from the focus group, but we do Spanish language focus groups too, and it is different than what the results of the general market. So it's really insightful, and that's what we're trying to do right now.
Thank you. Yana Garcia, our secretary, has joined us now, so we'll transition the panel. Thank you so much for, again, the great discussion. Everyone, please, thank you. And now I have the absolute honor of introducing our secretary for the Environmental Protection Agency here in California, Yana Garcia. Yana was just recently sworn in August, and prior to that, comes with a deep and rich background in so many of the issues that are near and dear to the board's heart. She was with the Attorney General's office, covering many of the issues here before the board. And previous to that, for a number of years, she was at the Environmental Protection Agency, where she was able to be the Deputy Secretary and Assistant Secretary for Tribal Affairs, Environmental Justice, and Border Relations. So without further ado, it's great to see you and hear and have you be part of the Water Quality Coordinating Committee meeting this morning, Yana. Good to see you.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks. Good morning, everyone. I hope y'all can hear me. I think so.
We can hear you well. Thank
great.
you.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Good morning. It's truly a pleasure to be here with all of you. Before I begin, I just really want to say how much I appreciate the work that you all are doing. I'm grateful for your service, and especially for your partnership in working through the last very difficult few years marked by a global pandemic with its many impacts across all aspects of our lives, and a quickly heating planet that we all are feeling as well on a day-to-day basis. And just, the work that we're all doing to protect water quality, and that you are doing in particular, and to ensure that Californians have access to clean, safe, and affordable drinking water has become both more critical and more challenging over the last decade, and especially over the last 3 years. These last few years exposed so many weaknesses in so many of our systems, weaknesses that exacerbated already present challenges faced by some of our most vulnerable residents, and that affected us personally, professionally, and as a community. So I just want to recognize that for all of you. And of course, as you all know better than I do, all of this was on top of challenges across the Delta, along the Central Valley, with Colorado River supplies, and in disadvantaged communities across our state, which all also continued during the pandemic. And throughout it all, you continued to do amazing things. Notwithstanding the stressors and the climate we continue to find ourselves in, you all kept moving forward to enforce regulations that protect the quality of the water we drink. And your service to our communities and to all Californians is just so appreciated by me, by all of the staff here on this call today, and by the governor. So I just really want to recognize that before jumping in. Now, a little bit about me, I guess, since as the chair just mentioned, I just started a few weeks ago. I'm almost entering my third month on the job as secretary, but have some history with the agency, of course. Had the great honor of serving as a deputy secretary for environmental justice, tribal affairs, and California-Mexico border relations, in which, also appreciated the great work that so many of you all do to protect the most vulnerable communities across our state. I come from a background of really doing community-based advocacy before joining government, and in many ways found myself surprised that I was even joining government at all, and did a lot of work advocating for pretty diverse communities across not just our state, but throughout the country. Did quite a bit of work prior to becoming an attorney, prior to even going to law school, advocating for Indigenous and tribal communities in places like Minnesota, Montana, New Mexico, and Utah, and had a really wonderful experience just thinking through how to transition away from fuel sources that caused and continue to cause a lot of environmental degradation, to cleaner renewable options for pretty isolated communities across the country. And I think that experience gave me just a really eye-opening way of considering land rights and water rights and our environment, and really was what ended up inspiring me to go to law school and to continue that community advocacy as an attorney. I've worked with several communities across the state, worked a lot for an environmental justice organization in Los Angeles called Communities for a Better Environment. And worked on all kinds of issues there in the communities of Wilmington and Huntington Park before coming back up here to the Bay Area. I am home right now. I'm joining you all from Oakland, where I was born in Berkeley and raised in Oakland, where I am from. My family is originally from Los Angeles and from Mexico before then. So am a very proud Californian and proud to be joining you all from Oakland, although I do make my way up to Sacramento quite a bit these days, and hope to make the move up there soon. And just a quick note, of course, on priorities for both the administration, but also for me personally. Of course, we can't deny the drought conditions that we're finding ourselves in. Unfortunately, the grim picture that we have is that our state is on track to lose 10% of its water supply by 2040, and we have increasing heat that is driving that in a way that seems to be even more quickly. And as many of you know, conservation is key to that, and sustainable management of our water supplies and quality, and so much of the work that you all do day in and day out is so critical to just protecting the limited resources that we have and stewarding those resources for generations to come. So one of my priorities that I think is likely most relevant to you all is to really improve the way that we are able to respond to the drought conditions that we're finding ourselves in. And as many of you know, this is not a one-time drought or a single year drought. This is an ongoing condition that we're finding, with maybe some interruption in wet years, or even just wet conditions in a single year. And so I think really improving our ability at the state level to support our local partners in responding not only to the supply challenges that we face, but the quality challenges that we face, ensuring that our consistent programs, including our programs aimed at funding infrastructure for drinking water and improvements in drinking water systems, are moving forward cognizant of the realities that we're not only facing today, but that we see coming down the pike in the years to come. And so responsiveness to drought, continuing to make the human right to water meaningful for all Californians are two areas that are high priority for me coming into this role as secretary. As many of you are aware, and as the chair just described as well, of course, given my experience doing specific environmental justice work throughout the agency, I also am keen on maintaining a focus on the most vulnerable residents at the statewide level and regionally and locally across the state. You all know this very well. You all know what it looks like to evaluate and focus on vulnerability in your own communities, thinking about those residents who have been hardest hit by the ongoing impacts of the pandemic, who suffer various pollution burdens, multiple stressors, socioeconomic stressors, and the like. I think throughout all of our work, our enforcement activities, our investment programs, our focused investments of just our time and our capacity as humans to understand what issues we should be responding to, what blind spots we might have, should always be focused on those who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and diminishing water supply. So that's sort of where I'm coming from in my perspective. And I think many of the things that the governor has recently announced, including the water supply strategy, offer us opportunities to continue to refine that focus on the most vulnerable communities, on those that need our assistance the most. And so much of the work you all do day in and day out supports that work as well. This year's conditions are unknown still. The state is taking action to prepare for a fourth dry year. And as I mentioned, conservation is a key part of our strategy, but it's really only one part. We need to be able to create new sources of water and increase storage. And it will take all of us working together to weather this drought and to save our water. Now, when Governor Newsom announced an adaptation strategy with the hotter, drier strategy back in August, that strategy was really aimed toward targeting and capturing, recycling, desalinating, and conserving our water supply. It aims to expand supplies by 1.6 million acre feet by 2030, in addition to creating more than 3 million acre feet of new storage. And the strategy really intensifies our focus statewide on supply actions in the 2020 Water Resilience Portfolio, which many of you are familiar with, and also invites the legislature to help us modernize the regulatory process to deliver projects faster. And this is something that will continue to be a priority for this administration, for us at the state board and at Cal EPA, and that really needs to be informed by the ongoing realities that are faced on the ground. Your state board members have adopted emergency water conservation regulations that, as you know, will ensure more aggressive conservation by local water agencies across the state. The first of these was adopted in January, and it banned wasteful water uses, including watering when it rains, using drinking water to clean driveways, and excessive outdoor watering that results in drinking water running into sidewalks and other areas. Regulations adopted in June also required local water agencies and suppliers to be at least at level 2 of their water shortage plans, instituting water saving strategies to address a shortage of up to 20% of their service areas based on local conditions, regional needs, and available water supplies. Now, Governor Newsom and state leaders have so far encouraged this localized approach over instituting statewide mandatory restrictions, as local agencies have really reported to the administration that this is the best approach that allows them to be best positioned to assess their conditions. Now, many of our state's most vulnerable communities still struggle to get access to clean, safe, and affordable drinking water. And that is something that we're aggressively addressing because it continues to be an urgent need, as we were just talking about. And this includes enhancing our programs to provide funding for consolidation and modernization projects in small communities, emergency repairs and replacements for dry wells, and bottled and hauled water deliveries. I want to just walk through a little bit of the budgetary details for your own information in case this is helpful to you all. In September, the governor enacted a budget that builds on the historic $5.2 billion investment in California water systems enacted in 21-22. And this was with an additional $3.6 billion for drought and water resilience over multiple years. This final budget includes $200 million for urban community drought relief grants, $100 million for small community drought relief grants as well, $50 million for emergency drinking water response, $71 million for a drought contingency fund. And this summer, the legislature approved an additional $200 million in funding for programs to support vulnerable communities. That's just a bit of the portfolio that was passed, and that, it's really on us to implement in partnership with all of you. And I invite you all to continue to work with us, of course, doing the work that you do day in and day out, but also flagging for us as needed issues that we may not be aware of, understanding that we are here to partner with you and value your partnership so much in achieving what we need to achieve on a statewide basis. And I just am so grateful for the work that you do and for the opportunity to speak with you this morning. Chair, do we have time for questions? I know we have about 15 minutes left, and I'm happy to take any questions.
We definitely do, and thank you for that. I know you, with the camera angle, can see the back of everyone's heads, but if you could see the front, there was a lot of smiling and nodding as you were going through your points. And I just want to say, what an honor it really is to be part of what truly feels like a generational moment, and to have Yana here with her background, her understanding of our issues, to not have to spend a year or two trying to understand what it is the boards do and the value of our work, just means a lot, because from day one, she's just stepping right in and helping carry through what are a lot of the priorities that many of you have been contributing to for a number of years now. So thank you, Yana.
Thank you for letting me know that. I can't see everyone, so that is helpful to know.
Please, questions for the secretary. And if you want to put them in writing because you're intimidated and bringing it up in person, do so. I do have the app in front of me. And then otherwise, do just raise your hand. Yes, Norma. And please introduce yourself.
Good morning, Secretary.
Good morning.
I'm Norma Camacho. I'm a board member in Region 4, the LA Ventura County area. And I know coming into this position, for you to come into this position as Secretary of Cali, PA, a lot of times in the past, Cali, PA has kind of worked in its particular silos in terms of hitting particular issues. And so I was just wondering, what are your thoughts or what are the policies that you're going to be enacting on Cali, PA to try to lessen those silos? And we're in a very dry and drier condition and very much in an emergency situation. How are you going to help all of our agencies work together towards a goal of ensuring water is available for all?
This is an excellent question. So I'll start with the silos that are often created in-house, even just within the Cali PA boards and departments. And I want to start with giving some kudos to my predecessor where kudos are due. You know, the former secretary, Jared Blumenfeld, really came in with, I think, a very clear agenda that played itself out, particularly in the enforcement context, but also across other programs, to make sure that communication was taking place across all of our boards, departments, and the Office of Environmental Health Hazards Assessment to better enhance how we approach some of our toughest enforcement and compliance challenges. As many of you know, as I think we all know as human beings, no one experiences the environment in any one single media. We are always exposed to water quality issues, air quality issues, pollution sources from land uses, et cetera, all at once. And I think no one understands that better than some of our most vulnerable community residents, overburdened residents, disproportionately burdened residents, Black and Brown communities across the state, and low-income communities. And so it's long been a focus of mine to work with teams, kind of cross-board and department teams on particular geographic efforts. I think that's one way that a lot of our staff throughout the agency, and many of you have even participated in community-based initiatives through our environmental justice task force work. That's been work that's been around for quite some time, but I think that's provided us one example that has been able to be elevated and has been, in addition to helpful in terms of achieving results on the ground, has also been able to provide a real example for teams, other cross-board and department and multimedia teams across Cali, PA, that's been really helpful from a sort of staff training and education information standpoint for a lot of our staff across the agency. That's been really important, and I think that will continue. Some of that work has also led us to partnering with staff from other agencies, in particular with the Natural Resources Agency. We currently have a methane task force, for example, that is a task force that is focused on enforcement of methane emission standards. And that's a task force that includes enforcement staff from the Air Resources Board, as well as from CalGEM within the Natural Resources Agency. And that's something that many advocates, many community residents have asked for a long time, and now is coming to fruition in an enhanced focus that the administration has on really reducing our reliance on fossil fuels, reducing our reliance on gas-powered vehicles, and on fossil fuels in general. And so I think we're going to see more of that. As Chair Esquivel knows well, and many of the state board members know very well, our coordination and communication with the Natural Resources Agency is really important, particularly as we respond to our ongoing drought. I think we'll see increasingly more attention on drought as a climate emergency. And I mean that in the sense of we'll see more in the statewide space that reflects water quality and water supply impacts in what are more traditionally climate spaces where all we're talking about are greenhouse gas emission reductions, for example. And that's something that the chair is already working on, and that Chair Esquivel has been really passionate about and has been a leader in. And I really intend to support the Water Board in continuing to do that great work. At the international scale, that happens all the time. You know, we were just in New York in September for Climate Week, for this big climate conference, and everyone spoke about water. And the way that we regulate, you know, our climate programs, the way we implement our climate programs to regulate greenhouse gas emissions is often, to your point, very siloed and does not account for some of the drier conditions that we're finding ourselves in, and some of the need to manage our water supplies and water quality at the same time in tandem with that. And so that's a really important area that I think we'll see more growth in, and that I'm really committed to as well.
Great question, board member. Thank you, Secretary. We have another question, and it might be helpful. The camera's up there if you want to turn around and address the secretary. You may need to actually, anyway, it's fine. I don't think you can be seen back there either, so whatever.
Maybe I'll stand up and go in all directions. I'll be omnidirectional.
Yeah. If you
Secretary,
pull this way a little more,
I prefer to see you over there. I don't know where.
Celeste, step this way, and you'll be able to, yeah, and then you'll be able to see her. There, you can turn around now. There you are.
So I'm looking at a camera instead of an actual face. Secretary, I am just thrilled with your appointment. My name is Celeste Cantu from the San Diego Regional Water Quality Control Board.
Hi, Celeste.
You bring the sensitivities and commitment for our border issues, something that the Water Board has always embraced, and we're just thrilled to have an advocate in your position now. So thank you so much for all the commitment and work that you have done, and we really look forward to working with you on these issues in the future. Thank you.
As do I. Thank you for your work.
Thank you for the awkward delivery, but it helps. You know, she kind of. Next question. And hearing none, then we're just thank you. I really appreciate your time with us here, Secretary. You know, what we've had here is a rich conversation these last 2 days, specifically on the water supply strategy. We did some deep dives yesterday on recycling, on desal, but importantly also had a panel here with our Danish counterparts. And so it was, you know, you hit on many and all the themes as if you were here both days. And so I think, again, that speaks to just your well-versedness in these issues that we're dealing with. And just thank you for your time today. I know we'll continue to have a lot more discussion. So thank you.
Definitely. Thank you all for having me. And it looked like a very fun agenda yesterday. I was sorry to miss it. I guess just one last thing that I just want to emphasize.
Oh, yes,
I think I mentioned, I just really welcome input from you all on anything that we may be missing. You know, to Celeste's point, of course, border issues, environmental justice, and tribal issues are going to remain very close to my heart. But to the extent that you all are in discussions with people locally on the ground, our local government partners, organizations that we should be talking to more about some of the solutions that we're looking to implement, you know, in particular as we're implementing the water supply strategy and looking at various infrastructure options to do that. We're really open to input from all of you, and you all are just such critical partners in that work. And so please don't ever hesitate to flag things for me and my team. I'm happy to come on visits. I love traveling around the state. So feel free to invite us down and show us some of what you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and just consider us a partner. And thank you so much again for having me.
Thank you. Give her a round of applause.
Bye-bye.
See you soon. Okay, that allows us now to transition to what will be our last tranche of regional board updates. And so I invite up, I think it's, there we are, thank you, Region 7, 5, and 2.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Paula Rasmussen with the Region 7 Colorado River Basin Regional Water Board. And similar to what you heard yesterday from Region 1, I plan to focus on one issue only today. And I will be talking about how the Salton Sea is changing and the adaptations that are being made due to the climate changes and the other changes in the sea. Next slide, please. The Salton Sea was formed in 1905 when there was flooding from a canal, and it allowed the Colorado River to flow into the Salton Basin for 18 months. Since then, the sea has been sustained by flows from agriculture, from runoff from the irrigation, and it has been evaporating ever since it was formed. There are no natural outlets to the sea, so the salinity level has been increasing over time. And now the levels of salinity are 50% higher than ocean water. And it's really too salty to support most fish life. And with the increases in salinity and also with nutrients and pesticides that are present from the irrigation flows, there are severe water quality issues that impact waterfowl and birds along the Pacific Flyway. The lake bed sediments are exposed now, and as the sea evaporates, they continue to be exposed. And these sediments are transported into the atmosphere, and they contribute to some of the worst the air quality in the nation. As you can see in this photo, the white edge along the playa is the playa that has been exposed due to the evaporation of the sea. Next slide. Now, in addition to the losses from evaporation, redirection of flows has also impacted the amount of water that flows to the sea. A quantification settlement agreement, or QSA, was signed in 2003 to establish water budgets and priorities for the California Colorado River water users. And in response to the QSA, the Imperial Irrigation District initiated a long-term transfer of agricultural water to urban water districts. This transfer allows for 300,000 acre-feet a year to be delivered to urban water districts, and this includes San Diego County Water Authority, Coachella Valley Water District, and the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. The transfer also results in less agricultural term water input to the sea. And as a result, the salinity levels will increase more rapidly and the lake will shrink more rapidly. To address environmental issues associated with the transfer, the State Water Board required the Imperial Irrigation District to add mitigation water to the Salton Sea for 15 years following the start of the transfer. The mitigation water requirement ended in 2017. Next slide. As a result of the water transfer, conservation and reuse, less agricultural runoff is available for the sea. This has resulted in elevated salt content and rapid evaporation of the water, resulting in exposed playa. For example, since around 2003, 11 feet of decline in the water level has occurred, and there are about 20,000 acres of playa that have been exposed. Over the next 20 years, the lake is expected to shrink 30%. So as noted in the water supply strategy, this is our new climate reality. We must adapt. At the Salton Sea, adaptation actions are being implemented. Next slide. The Salton Sea Task Force was formed to identify short and medium-term goals to address air quality and ecological threats. The task force charged the Natural Resources Agency to develop a comprehensive management plan, referred to as the Salton Sea Management Plan, or SSMP, to meet these short and medium-term habitat and dust suppression projects over a 10-year period. The SSMP was released in 2017. Projects are underway for both dust suppression and habitat enhancement. This photo is of a vegetation enhancement project that will provide dust suppression. Next slide. This photo shows the ongoing construction of the Species Conservation Habitat Project at the southern end of the Salton Sea near the mouth of the New River. The Species Conservation Habitat Project will reduce exposed lake bed and create environmental habitat by creating a network of ponds with islands and areas of varying water depths to provide fish and wildlife habitat and suppress dust emissions to improve the regional air quality. The project is on schedule with 60% of the construction completed and is on track to be completed in 2023. Next slide. The Colorado River Basin Regional Board recently toured this site, and when viewed in person, the scope of the project is impressive. The project encompasses over 4,000 acres. Now, along with the 10-year plan, the Natural Resources Agency is also developing a plan forward for long-term restoration and management of the Salton Sea, which would be beyond the 10-year plan. The state team contracted with the University of California in Santa Cruz to facilitate an independent review panel to conduct a feasibility assessment for long-term strategy. And this assessment also includes evaluating water importation as a feasibility. The long-term plan is scheduled to be submitted to the state board this December. So in conclusion, there are adaptations efforts underway to address the shrinking of the Salton Sea, including a 10-year plan and the long-term strategy. Thank you.
Patrick Palupa with the Central Valley Water Board. Just for starters, I do want to really express my gratitude for everybody for making it out here today, even especially our guests all the way from Copenhagen or other areas beyond. Not gonna lie, I think for our management team, for our staff, it's been a rough few years. And I think when we get into these forums and we talk amongst each other and we get to understand our values and the projects that other regions are working on, and certainly the dedication of all of the regional board members themselves who essentially have taken on these really tough issues in a volunteer position, really express my gratitude. Really helps, at least for me, recharge the batteries a little bit and go back into the trenches, so to speak, inspired from the work that's going on in other areas. So I think to get into kind of the resiliency strategy, I tend to call it the hotter dryer, just because those are the words that jumped out to me. And there's certainly talking about it in frank terms that everybody understands. When the governor releases a policy that says hotter dryer, that resonates. It's not aridification so much. It's not, resiliency, which nobody can quite pin down what it means. Hotter dryer really hits you, and it acknowledges that there are incredible challenges that this state faces as we move forward in a climate that is rapidly changing. And for us in the Central Valley with such a huge expanse, I really want to touch on kind of three issues and really talk about, frankly, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Three different type of things that we're challenged to deal with within the Central Valley. And I think to start off, the good is that when you talk about stormwater capture and when you talk about recharge of the aquifers, there are incredible potential projects within the Central Valley that can be done very cost effectively, particularly within agricultural flood-mar contexts. I certainly look at some of the cool projects that happen in the urban landscape, and then look at the price tag and say, wow, that is quite unbelievably expensive. It certainly is where our values as an organization lie. But oftentimes, like when the picture was shown yesterday of Fresno recapturing 17,000 acre feet in a floodplain, they really just had to grab a few bulldozers and put a few berms in, and boom, that's 17,000 acre feet done very, very cost effectively in a former sandy channel that can be relatively easily rehabilitated into a stormwater recapture area. There are infiltration basins within the Central Valley that have been operational for 60, 70 years. If you look back at the soil surveys that were conducted in the 1910s and the 1920s, they talked about areas of stormwater recapture, of infiltration capacity next to the streams and rivers of the Central Valley. And certainly if you look at the Tulare Lake Basin, where there used to be, the largest lake, at least by area, kind of west of the Mississippi, outside of Tahoe, it truly an extraordinary. Well, in certain years it was bigger. Absolutely was bigger. It kind of extended the entire reach of the basin, and the advocates tend to say it was bigger than Tahoe aerial extent. But there's an enormous potential to recharge the valley's aquifers at a relatively cost that is in line. And you also look at how those projects have been done. A few people know about it, but the city of Modesto, they've been sending their they've been recharging their water with stormwater through rock wells in this massive project that's been going on, 50, 60 years since they started installing those things. There's really a cost kind of a measure. They thought it was cheap to just kind of dig pits and line them with rocks, and that's where they sent the stormwater. And it turns out that this relatively old technology is actually proving incredibly effective at recharging their aquifers, and it's certainly something that can be copied relatively cost effectively throughout many of the valley's communities, and certainly some of the communities across the state. Now, in terms of the bad is really the disappointing aspect. If you looked at the map that Jennifer West put up about the direct potable recharge projects going on in the state of California, there are zero in the Central Valley. In an area where we have roughly a population that's been estimated. I think the most recent numbers I saw from the Sustainability and Health Equity Lab at UC Berkeley published a paper not too long ago estimating there's about 370,000 Californians that are drinking water from contaminated wells. That's a mix of arsenic, radionuclides, and especially nitrate. You have those drinking waters are those contaminated drinking water wells are particularly acute in the Central Valley, and yet we have zero direct potable projects moving forward in the Central Valley. And the reason is infrastructure. Decades and decades of disinvestment in the Valley communities leaves us with, we have in the Central Valley, more than half of all the publicly owned treatment works that discharge to land are in the Central Valley. Huge kind of share of all of those projects that you would think would be eligible for direct potable. None of them are eligible, in terms of where they are, in terms of their treatment capacity. We're really behind the curve, and it's decades of disinvestment that has led that to it, because you need both the treatment plant, to treat to a very advanced level, and then the infrastructure to get that drinking water to the people that need it most acutely. And those people tend to be in rural areas in the Central Valley where there is not developed infrastructure to get drinking water to them, even if you had a treatment plant that could treat to that level. And you also add to the kind of the infrastructure needs. Much as we have a tenuous relationship with some of the irrigation districts and the agricultural partners in the region, they do have very real concerns about the ability to move stormwater recapture project water around within their systems. Certainly, they bear part of the responsibility, because subsidence is what kind of has killed a lot of the capacities in the canals in the Central Valley. But when you have those extreme flows come in, and you have, like the Friant Water Authority saying, we can only move about, 25% of the capacity of these canals, this water, we're looking at it, that this would be great to recharge our aquifers, but our canals are broken, cracked, and cannot move the water that they were designed to carry because of regional subsidence issues. It's heartbreaking to the growers looking at that water going away, and it's heartbreaking to the communities that would say, hey, we would love to recharge our aquifers and replenish our drinking water needs with that water. So the infrastructure needs in the Central Valley are the ugly. It's truly extraordinary needs. Even with the tremendous investments that the state board and other entities have been investing in the Central Valley, the need is just absolutely enormous. And last but not least, there's the that was the bad, and the ugly is, and I say ugly, not as ugly meaning bad. It's just one of those projects that really is challenging to permit. It's challenging to accept. Is the brackish water desalination projects that will inevitably occur in the Central Valley. They're occurring in small areas right now. We've copied a playbook from Region 8 for many years to try and develop a kind of a strategy for managing salinity in the Central Valley. It is and has to be one of the unifying rallying calls for agriculture and communities in the valley. The valley's agricultural productivity will die unless we develop solutions to the salinity problem. There are over 250,000 acres that have already been taken out of production due to salinification within the soils of some of the productive agricultural lands in the valley. There's an additional 1.5 million acres that are salinity threatened. And by the end of this decade, so by the end of 2030, we're talking about a $3 billion per year minimum impacts to agriculture within the Central Valley due to salinity impacts. So this is a super urgent issue. Thankfully, we're working on it. We're working on it collaboratively through the prioritization and optimization study and through CV SALT to solve these problems. And frankly, it is kind of the challenge that we have taken up together in the valley that will result in some projects that will need some very, very kind of ugly solutions, whether it is partnering with oil and gas industry to use deep well injection, as kind of Jonathan alluded to yesterday, to dispose of desalt or brines, whether it's salt sacrifice areas where you acknowledge that these are massive parts of our landscape that just cannot be saved. Maybe they're best converted to solar farms. Maybe they're, as kind of marginal agricultural lands. You look at the current projects for evaporation basins. Thousands of acres in the valley are already being used for salt evaporation basins. And with that come huge environmental challenges. We don't want mini salton seas developing in those areas. Some of those projects are managed well. Some of those are managed less well. And so I think that's kind of the mix, when we talk, just to kind of recap, the good, there's incredible potential for aquifer recharge projects within the Central Valley. I think and they can be done very cost effectively in many cases. The bad is the infrastructure needs prevent water from getting to some of the most urgent needs within the Central Valley, the thousands and thousands of people who are using domestic wells that are contaminated by nitrates, arsenic, and radionucleotides. And lastly, the ugly, the long-term solutions that are tough to permit, not necessarily beautiful to look at when you look at a salt sacrifice area, or if you look at a series of oil field wells that are being used for salt injection, but those are absolutely need to be part of the solution as we look forward to kind of making our way towards a hotter, drier future. That's an inevitability, unfortunately, at this point. So that's it for Region 5, and I'll hand it back to Eileen.
Good morning. I'm Eileen White, and I'm with the San Francisco Bay region, and I'm the last region update today. And I think what you'll see, and what I've heard between yesterday and today, is we all have in each of our regions different challenges and different opportunities. As Patrick talked about, the groundwater basins, we don't have that same geology in the Bay Area. So next slide, please. I'm going to briefly describe Region 2's actions to accelerate climate change, and then I'm going to describe our actions we're taking to support California's water supply strategy, adapting to a hotter, drier future. Next slide, please. The Water Quality Control Plan for the San Francisco Basin, or Basin Plan, is the Water Board's water quality control planning document. The Basin Plan had no description of climate change and its relevance to the Water Board's regulatory programs. So this past July, our board adopted a climate change basin amendment, which acknowledges climate change, and it makes the reader think about climate change as we're answering various questions as far as permitting. And so we think this will help as we go forward in the future, and it was just something we realized we were missing in our basin plan. Next slide, please. A lot of what we do in the San Francisco Bay region is about regional collaboration, kind of like we heard from our public information staff this morning. So much has to be done collaboratively. And so the regional board has contributed to several long-range planning efforts related to shoreline and bay-wide climate resilience through several different partnerships. We've worked with the Bay Conservation and Development Commission to develop a Bay Adapt joint platform, and it's a regional strategy for a rising bay, which is a roadmap for how the bay is going to adapt faster, better, and more equitably to a rising bay. It focuses on the people, the information, the plans, the projects, and progress that will help catalyze protection of communities, businesses, and infrastructure. We've also worked with the Bay Area Regional Collaborative to develop the Shared Work Plan, which is a common plan to support collaboration, interagency, and community-based shoreline projects in the San Francisco Bay region. We've worked with the San Francisco Estuary Partnership to develop the Estuary Blue Plan, which maps out the regional collaboration actions needed for a healthy, resilient San Francisco Bay. These planning efforts establish a foundation to support local communities in the Bay and to identify and secure funding for projects that will address and protect from sea level rise and other climate impacts. Next slide, please. The regional board has used its various regulatory tools to require various facilities, such as wastewater facilities, bay landfills, and industrial facilities and refineries, to conduct climate change vulnerability assessments and prepare adaptation plans. As part of the second nutrient watershed permit, we're requiring the 37 wastewater utilities that discharge the San Francisco Bay to complete a regional recycle water plan that will look at their opportunities for each of the wastewater agencies, what they can do with recycled water, and the potential to reduce nutrients. That regional study will be completed in July of next year and should help advance more recycled water projects in the San Francisco Bay region. Next slide, please. Our board recently adopted the municipal stormwater permit, and this allows multi-benefit district or regional scale projects. Recognizing that such projects can require more coordination and planning, the permit also has flexibility to support those projects, including allowing additional time to permit these projects. These projects include stormwater capture and non-potable use for irrigation purposes and toilet flushing that displaces potable water use, and then additional climate resilient benefits like reducing the urban heat island effect. Yesterday, you heard about Region 4, and they have substantial plans for infiltrating stormwater. But Region 2's clay soils limit infiltration, and most of our infiltration geology is already being used by water districts for managed aquifer recharge to get water into the ground. So we have very limited opportunity compared to some of the other regions in California. The MRP requires permittees to further develop their existing green stormwater infrastructure plans, which describe how they will shift their drainage systems from gray to green over the coming decades. The MRP includes flexibility for permittees to coordinate with other climate resilience efforts. During the current 5-year permit term, the permittees will submit information to help establish implementation requirements during future permit terms. Next slide. Key aspects of Region 2's creek and wetland fill program includes adapting the estuary to rising tides. This is using appropriate green infrastructure, such as tidal marsh and shallow sloped ecotone levees, to restore and maintain San Francisco Bay wetlands while also protecting the urban environment. Region 2 is an active participant in the Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team, which is a multi-agency team comprised of EPA, the State Board, the Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, with a goal to facilitate wetland restoration to adapt to protected sea level rise. We're also working with several other agencies to make sure that we're identifying climate adaptation needs and coordinated approaches to address them. We're working collaboratively with the Corps of Engineers to increase beneficial use of dredge material in San Francisco Bay. We see dredge material as an opportunity rather than as a challenge. Next slide, please. Water recycling. So we look for opportunities. The San Francisco Bay region, roughly about 10% of the wastewater is recycled. Once again, we have unique geography. There's a lot of hills. Our wastewater plants are sited by the bay. So you have to think about the greenhouse gas emissions. That it's one thing to treat the wastewater to be able to reuse for irrigation or to put into a reservoir, but those reservoirs are up in the hills. So you have to pump it. So we have to look at that and balance that as we look for recycled water opportunities in the future. But we're very hopeful that the regional study that's going to be completed next summer will identify what is the most cost-effective recycled water projects for the Bay Area. We've also been working with Google, Facebook, and Microsoft to permit recycled water use for irrigation and toilet flushing on their campuses. We're also recognized that SB 966 shifts permitting authority from the Division of Drinking Water and the regional boards to the local agencies who don't necessarily have the resources or expertise to permit recycled water projects. So our goal is to do outreach and coordination to make sure we work with them to make sure that permitting does not become a barrier to executing more recycled water projects in the Bay Area. Next slide, please. So the San Francisco Bay region has less groundwater than Patrick has described for the San Joaquin Basin. We're very different. We have about 1,200 supply wells, and in a normal year, groundwater only supplies about 20% of the water supply for the San Francisco Bay region. That increases substantially in times of drought, so protecting our groundwater supplies is a high priority. Next slide, please. So what we've done is we are engaging with the local agencies and we're working with them to evaluate their baseline conditions and to document those in fact sheets. And then we're making sure we're developing rapports with each of the groundwater basins and then developing recommendations that we can incorporate into future permits to make sure that sustainable groundwater management becomes a higher priority for the Bay Area than maybe it has been in the past, since we don't rely on groundwater as much as other regions in the state. Next slide, please. So something else with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act provides us an explicit basin prioritization based on groundwater use concerns of potentially worsening drought conditions. We've realized we now need to look at the groundwater basins and prioritize them differently. We now need to look at the impacts of climate change on groundwater basins. We also want to look at every groundwater basin through the lens of environmental justice. So we're now developing a new framework to prioritize, making sure we're looking at the groundwater basins that are in the disadvantaged communities and prioritizing those over other groundwater basins. We're also making sure we're working on supply well protection and then our aquifer recharge permitting to make sure we're permitting our aquifer recharge projects. Next slide, please. Aquifer recharge is an important component of sustainable groundwater management. Typically, local agencies use percolation ponds, spreading basins, in-stream recharge, or injection wells to recharge aquifers. We permit recharge projects when the source water contains potential contaminants such as recycled water, captured urban stormwater, or potable water. And in the next couple slides, I just want to talk about a couple projects we've permitted in the Bay Area. Next slide, please. We worked with the Sonoma Valley to pilot their project, and the purpose of this project was to identify what was the capacity of the groundwater basin, and if they stored the water over time, could it maintain the quality? This was a very successful pilot project, so now they're looking to expand it. So this is one example in the Bay Area. Next slide, please. We also permitted East Bay Mud's pilot project, which is a project in San Lorenzo. It's only a 1 million gallon per day, but once again, they want to start small before going big. And they wanted to see, once again, if they injected the water into the basin, when would it be there when they come back? What would be the quality? It's been successful. So their plans are to expand this 1 million gallon per day project, which is an emergency drought supply, to 10 million gallons per day in the future. So we are, as water supply is becoming more scarce, the water agencies in the Bay Area are looking more at groundwater projects than they have in the past. Next slide, please. So by working collaboratively with all our stakeholders, with academia, with the water agencies, the wastewater agencies, the stormwater agencies, with our scientists, our nonprofits, we will develop a diverse and resilient water supply for California. So we are prepared for that hotter, drier future. Next slide, please. In closing, One Water is an integrated and inclusive approach to water resource management where all water has an intrinsic value to humans and the environment. If you want to click again. As you can see in this graphic, One Water redefines the simplified water cycle that we learned in elementary school. Drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, and engineered wetlands all come together in harmony, as do humans, wildlife, and the environment. Around the graphic are common goals shared by the vision of One Water. And as we look to the future of California, we're seeing One Water is where we're headed. Thank you.
Thank you all. Again, just makes me very appreciative of what is an incredible amount of leadership spread throughout the state, just embodied in all of our regions. So thanks for that. And if you have any questions, please do submit them written or please raise your hand. And we do have one question from John Skandura, which is, will the likely reductions in Colorado River water impact the Salton Sea Management Plan? Perhaps to you, Paula.
Yes. Simply, yes. I mean, it will reduce the flows to the irrigated lands potentially, depending on how they figure it out. But you can see that if there's less water going to irrigated land, then there's less water flows to the Salton Sea, which exposes more playa and puts more dust in the air. Therefore, the plans that are in development are critical.
Yeah, certainly. I think what we all know, the lesson going back 20 years ago to the quantification settlement agreement, when the can was just kind of kicked down the road a bit, is that if we don't understand what the impacts are, if we don't mitigate for them, account for them, then they'll just continue to add to what is a legacy of a lot of that down at the sea. So, yeah, thank you. Any other questions for the panelists? Yes. Both hands. I'll go first to Board Member Firestone.
Great. My question is, both in the Central Valley and in the Colorado region, you have a lot of ag drainage that causes salt issues, right? Salton Sea. Patrick, you talked a lot about the whole point of CV salts is to figure out what to do with the salt problem in the valley. A huge component that we talked about yesterday and in the water supply strategy is desalination. And in the governor's, or not the governor's, in CNRA's long-term plan, I think the expert panel suggested for Salton Sea that there be a desalination plant to help with Salton Sea. And then CV Salts is doing some planning for a long time, a couple decades. So I'm just wondering if you all could comment on the role of desalination for really surface waters, not just brackish groundwater, but surface waters inland. And if that's something that you see as likely to be needed as a component of water supply and an ecosystem and community health.
So I think a lot of the issues with respect to the salinity issues are focused on groundwater, even through CV salts. The big salinity issue in the Central Valley, as you well know, is the point X in the delta and how the flows will be affected. Second biggest kind of surface water component is frankly the degradation of the San Joaquin River, and essentially the failure of all the joint water projects that have been developed over the years to develop a brine line or to develop a The San Luis Drain, which was obviously a vital part of the project that never actually got completed, is one of the drivers of some of the salinity issues within the Central Valley. And so by default, essentially the San Joaquin River is being used as the brine line for the Central Valley, rightly or wrongly. The Central Valley Water Board essentially put some limits on the use of that as a brine line with a TMDL that was adopted about 15, 20 years ago. But that is constrained so much by how the water management activities of the irrigation districts are worked through. Ideally you do have things like the San Joaquin Restoration Project increasing the flows. And when the flows are increased, you do wind up having more flushing. And that actually, when it rains, you have a salt capacity within the San Joaquin River that won't cause environmental degradation. You can actually put salt back in the system. That's kind of how it used to work before. You'd have the salt, crust up on the soil, and then you'd have big flushing events. And before the irrigation districts built, that was kind of how it worked. Nowadays, the challenge is to utilize that within a very, very built structure, and to use some flushing, some retention basins, and others to manage the salinity within the San Joaquin River that way. Lots of modeling. Holy smokes! There's a number of different modeling efforts, but the vast majority of the CV salts work, having done that component and being constrained by the Delta plan, frankly, in terms of how that salinity structure works. Most of the CV salts work deals with groundwater, and the challenge there actually is to concentrate the salt, right? The agricultural lands of the South Valley. The idea is you reuse the water, you reuse the water, you reuse the water. You apply it sometimes 7, 8, 9, 10 times to the crops, gradually progressing kind of as you go down the alluvial fan to more salt tolerant crops. And at the bottom, ideally you have water that is salty enough to desalt, which is kind of a twist, but you have to get it to a certain level before it makes any sense to desalt it. Then you desalt it and you have a stream that can both kind of supply potentially municipal uses, certainly agricultural uses. And then if you figure out where you put the brine, whether it's deep well injection or somewhere else, there was, for what it's worth, there was a lot of kind of scoping of trying to get it to East Bay mud. East Bay mud, certainly the history there, which I didn't realize, that there was a lot of canneries that were supposed to be operating back when there was a very healthy kind of sardine and fish industry in the Bay Area. So East Bay mud was designed with that to continue in perpetuity. So, at times they wanted more salt, but I don't think they want salt with agricultural byproducts in it. So I do think, and discharging to a marine protected area off the coast of Monterey, I know some of the Aggies are saying, well, let's just do that. I don't know if that's going to work ever. So, the challenge is to figure out where you go locally, and by locally, somewhere in valley, essentially salt solution. That's when you're talking about agricultural salt sacrifice areas, deep well injection, evaporation basins, which again, a lot of those are up and running, taking salty water. I think Sigma is going to force the retirement of a lot of acres of marginally productive agricultural lands. That presents a bit of an opportunity for that. Sigma also will increase the demand and the cost for water, which makes the ability to kind of sell desalted water a little more economically viable. So it's all those factors that we're kind of considering. But to answer your question more directly, it's mostly groundwater desalters that we're looking at, brackish desalting, because the surface water issues are largely constrained by how much water is in the river and how that water is managed, less discharges, so that the regional board has the authority over.
Just real briefly, since we're about time, there's not a lot of surface water in our region. And what little surface water there is, the majority of it flows to the Salton Sea. And as you've heard, the Salton Sea is already very impacted. So, a lot of the salt is concentrated from irrigated flows. Those lands are already very salty from the historical seas that were there prior to this current version of the Salton Sea. So there's a lot of salt already, and I'm just hopeful that as they look at the long range plan, that the issue of the salts in the sea are part of that element. And I know they are. Some of the solutions that have been put forth in the long range plan do include looking at, desalination, or as Patrick said, sacrifice areas too. So I really think that's where it's going.
Mr. Chairman and fellow board members, I wanted to express my appreciation to each of the executive officers for your presentations. The last 2 days, I'm struck anew as to the breadth of your portfolios and responsibilities. We've focused mostly on external facing issues, and what's behind the curtain are the organizations that you lead, the difficulties of the last couple of years in managing a remote workforce, not having people deployed in the field as you would have normally done. And now you're in this hybrid situation of managing that transition and how it will look over the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months. But I just thought I'm so optimistic, given your strengths and experience and capabilities, that we will work our way through these challenges, because without it, your work wouldn't be so interesting. And I'm just very much struck by the quality of executive officers we have, and deeply grateful in California that we as board members are here to support you. So thank you.
Yes, time is running out for at least my stay here in California for this time. So I'd like to take the opportunity to appreciate the opportunity of taking part here, learning about your, vast challenges, to put it mildly. The very, very impressive efforts and dedication, and gaining insight in which steps are taking. A lot of impressive efforts on the supply side in particular, but also the comprehensiveness of other steps and so on. And just a few things, reflections were brought to me also by listening to the various regional committees. First of all, I have a bit lacked the role of the water service providers when listening to you. In our case, the water service providers they're mandatory to be the ones giving the education programs to the schools. It's part of their job to do that, and they're taking big pride in doing it. And so that's been going on for years. So everybody at home has been through that effort. Secondly, when listening, when looking at a water situation, and particularly in the water scarcity, of course, I'm also aware of the low-hanging fruits. And to me, the issue of non-revenue water is really a low-hanging fruit. Having places with we use a percentage scale, but a magnitude of water leakage in water scarcity areas. Something tells me, wait, why is this going on? Are the water service providers? I mean, they're neither bad or ugly, but do they have the opportunity to be good? Are they incentivized? Does it make sense in their world to actually take these steps? And because why don't they do the obvious? Anyhow, we have been working with the Molson Niguel utility down in, I guess it's Region 9, San Diego. I learned something. And they have taken on some of the solutions we can offer from back home. I'm quite certain that my colleagues who will stay over here are very ready to share the results from that particular site. I'm quite certain they will be happy to engage in dialogue with each of the regional boards. And eventually, I'm a personal fan of pilot projects. I noticed on the last from San Francisco, you're also dealing with that pilot projects to showcase. Don't tell it, show it. We will be absolutely happy to engage in pilot activities, being on non-revenue water or some of the other ones where we might have something to offer. So please feel free to approach us. We will be very proud if if you do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Henrik. And again, thanks for your participation in our discussion these last days. It's really enriched things. And I will note, Knowlton Miguel was actually at the State Water Resources Control Board at one of our informational items, talking about just that, all of their innovative work, the investments they've made, the data, especially that's facilitated that. So I appreciate that acknowledgement of them and the work that's going on within the state. Other questions for the panelists? We have about 5 minutes. So yes, Norma.
Yes, this is for Eileen, and I'm wondering if we have another WQCC get-together to have maybe a more in-depth discussion about your BRIT process and how that has expedited permitting of a lot of major projects in the Bay Area. And maybe that's something that many of the other regions could potentially emulate in the future, as we're all going to be challenged with getting water supply projects on the ground fairly soon. So,
and I'd be happy to meet with people individually and share. But for us in the Bay Area, as I kind of had my second to last slide, collaboration is really the key to permitting and to really addressing climate change and water supply resilience. It's the key. Yeah.
Great, Jean-Pierre, we get to you.
Yeah, this question is more aimed toward Patrick, the largest agriculture region in all of our water board family. And, as we talked earlier about water conservation projects earlier, and it was aimed a little bit more toward water providers. But, one of our big water users in our California portfolio is agriculture. So one of the things I haven't heard us talk about is, close collaboration with CDFA. I know our water rights division within the board has been addressing, the severe issues in water diversion, and it has taken some, pretty historically tough decisions. But, collaboration with CDFA, I think, is very important because they are, the closest agency in the sister family of agencies with agriculture. And, I would love to hear a little bit more comments on, our work with CDFA, and if you could share a little bit of what you're doing in your region, that would be appreciated.
Oh, you bet. I think Karen Ross has our numbers on speed dial at the Central Valley, and even next week, I think I'm meeting with one of the new undersecretaries at CDFA. Some of the key points of collaboration I know within our region are on healthy soils initiatives, and kind of water supply and water resiliency is something that I know the main interface is with water rights, because I think that from the agricultural perspective, a lot of the gains, especially in the Central Valley for irrigation efficiency, essentially unlocked more land to develop and unlocked a lot more potential. And I think we're, I was at a conference not too long ago about Sigma groundwater, and CDFA certainly cut a large profile there because I think that is being revisited, and that is kind of a very large kind of mental shift from the grower community, from CDFA, from the water boards, about how we're going to collectively manage this resource. And really, I think the emphasis, whether it's CV salts, whether it's healthy soils, whether it's water rights, to preserve and protect the high value agricultural productivity of the Central Valley without kind of, and making some hard decisions. It's kind of buried in there. If I've read probably too many groundwater sustainability plans, but demand management is usually just the kind of thing that gets danced around and you don't want to really talk about it. But I think it's coming to the forefront and it's being accelerated. Every conversation that I've had with CDFA, with the State Water Board that's managing some of the Sigma projects is really saying, Sigma and everybody anticipated that we could be driving the car 55 miles an hour towards our target. Well, we got to go 100 miles an hour because we're still in the middle of a drought that is not proving to go away. And the respite that we had with a relatively okay water year was just that. It was a brief respite amidst a very, very arid future that we're facing. So I think those are the main points which we interact with CDFA, talking healthy soils, water management, and certainly I think continuing support, at least in our region, for the structure of the Irrigated Lands Coalition. I'll also add we have a lot of conversation about dairies. Can't get into those conversations in front of state board members because there's a big petition pending. But that's the other kind of point in which I know CDFA has a lot of interest in what's happening both at the regions and the state board.
Oh, the California Department of Food and Agriculture. Yeah. Okay, we are at time. I did want to throw out Jim Stahl's question because, and here, all the written questions, we'll try to summarize them and actually just kind of provide information because I think it'll be helpful because it's a good summary of what people are interested in. But his question was going to be, or is excellent presentations, would like to hear about biosolids and energy, methane production and management. That could take some time. And we're at time, but I did want to throw it out there to continue to feed what is a really rich discussion all amongst us, and just thank you. Unless you want to take 30-second clip.
30 seconds. I will say that there are huge sums of money being spent for dairy digester programs for methane management. Biosolids certainly is a much more challenging issue. The Valley receives biosolids from I think just about every one of your regions, and the management, long-term management of that is still a struggle. And before we close, I definitely love the Danish contingent suggestion. I think what I heard him say was a consumer confidence report for drinking water systems targeted at middle schoolers and part of the academic curriculum. I think that would be awesome, and maybe get the wastewater providers to do the same. And I think we're in good shape.
Fantastic. Big round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you again to all the regions. They were incredible updates. Okay, let's take a 15-ish minute break, and we will try to start on time here at 11 with our permit streamlining discussion. The reveal.
Yeah, I took the wrong car there. I had added 10 minutes to my commute. I was like, wait, I was deep in thought. It's just like, yeah. And it's doing it back. Like, it's not the right freeway. Sometimes things need more attention than you think have. All right, well, I'll play up. Whatever you want to drop in, I'll be upstairs. So I go. I've been yeah, no, it's great. It's great.
I lived all over. Oh, yeah. Good morning. Well, I am here for that. It's just not surgery.
Sacrifice areas, yeah. There's just a lot of essentially what they do even today is they take like areas where you can't control just about anything, and after water's been used, it does basically photograph this area, and you just make sure you've got a tidal drain system. It's got, but no problem. Not at all. Yeah, it's not perfect. Some people are still kind of having to turn around. Elementary school, where did civilization there's no huge pressure. So it's kind of wild when you go there. Fire away while we're talking. I know.
what we've been doing which is why they can submit. So I'm having a working on this quite a while.
It's great.
I know. So I don't know. I mean, business on top, comfort on bottom. So yeah, right now I'm like, we'll see. Cool. Right. So yeah.
Well, I'm gonna set my bag down
Ready to
here
go.
and do some savings.
Y'all good to go? Any questions?
I'm gonna refer to you as my esteemed colleague. Little buddy.
So that's where we.
Hi. What's that?
Good.
I'm good. Yeah, you got to take the presentation.
Well, you did have the date wrong, Meredith.
I know. Hi. Hello. How are you?
Just want to let you know that I will need to sneak out a little bit early.
Okay.
So don't take it
I
personally.
won't. No.
Say, oh, boy, what did I say?
I'm gonna call you out when you leave. How are you?
Good. And you?
Good.
Surviving?
Yeah.
All right. You know, I know when I see all the updates on the water rights division and all the, all the tough decisions, I always think of you.
Not Eric Ekdahl, so he's.
But still, eventually.
Yeah, no, it's still.
Gets on your shoulders.
Yeah, I'm hoping it rains.
We all are because, like the wine grape crops
More than any of us.
in the central coast, Santa Barbara County, San Luis Obispo, and Monterey County, that's historically lowest crop ever, down from 25 to 50%. Drought is the biggest contributor because of the toxicity of the soil, lack of flushing. And then the other, just a perfect storm of a terrible spring, heavy winds, poor fruit sets, everything kind of lined up in the wrong direction.
Yeah, unfortunately, everything I'm seeing about early indicators is not too promising. Triple anemia and all that.
I got on my laptop the direct, NOAA predictor, and sometimes I avoid looking at it because I'm hoping I'll see a little surprise, but like you say, it doesn't look.
I mean, those predictions are always kind of like 50% chance, but I'd rather have them saying it's looking the other way.
Yeah, and I mean, all it needs is a couple of atmospheric rivers.
Right, well, that's what's scary. It's really what it comes down to.
Yeah. It's almost like gambling.
Yeah.
And, I was telling John Bishop yesterday, I said, John, we talked about desalinization, recycling water. Rainwater is actually recycled water. And it's an atmospheric river is our biggest seawater desal project, right? You're right. When you think about it. Good to see you.
Yeah, we'll have a safe trip.
Thank you.
One of my posts is kind of part-time time spending on managing the work stage. But you know, I mean, like I can go on. But yes, technically, it's all done right now. One of those things
I know, I like that though. I like that. They're all guilting themselves. They're like, Joaquin just wanted it. Yeah, unless you give her, Joaquin does. Go do it. And I don't even have to say it. I don't have to say it. I'm just like, they're guilting themselves. Okay, everyone. Let's try to stay on schedule. It has been 2 days of really rich conversations, so I appreciate that we want to try to carry them on. No, I think it's loud enough. Okay, everyone. Let's start to gather and sit down now so we can begin our panel discussion on time. All right, everyone, let's start to take a seat so that we can begin. Well, we're no longer on time, so if I have to guilt you, I'm just kidding. Truly, I really appreciate that. We have, it's been a rich 2 days and so much great discussion, and glad to be able to start to come into the home stretch with our last panel, and then we'll have a last discussion on the legal side with Michael Lawfer, and then some follow-up. But glad to hand things over to the vice chair to introduce our discussion now. Thanks, everyone.
Can you hear me? There we go. All right. Well, thank you. I have to just agree with Alexis that this has been just really wonderful to be together, to see you all. My favorite part is hearing from the regional boards, and I always look forward to WQCC. And kicking off this one of the last panels here, continuing on our theme of resilience and the governor's water supply strategy, we're going to talk about something that we can all do together, and that is expediting the permit process on really important projects. And so looking at activities that help meet the resiliency goals, both in terms of water supply, but watershed health, forest resiliency. And we're going to be talking about several general orders that our board has adopted, or in one case in the process of adopting. So specifically, the large habitat general order. This was one of our board's top priorities, and we just adopted it in August, a few months ago. And that really builds on a prior general order that we had adopted for the small habitat restoration projects. And so I know Eric will be talking about his thoughts on moving forward on that. And then Phil's going to be talking about forest wildfire and forest resiliency, and some of the activities that we're doing working in coordination with CAL FIRE and the Resources Agency, specifically on vegetation treatment, and also a general order that our staff is working on for utility corridor. So with this, I'll turn it over to Eric. Thank you.
Thank you, and hello everyone. Eric Oppenheimer with the State Board here. Phil Crater is also with me today, and we're going to be talking about general orders and expediting permits. And Phil and I are both longtime kind of lifer employees with the water boards. We both worked for regional boards. Phil and I both worked for the Central Valley Regional Board. Additionally, I had started at the Lahontan Regional Board, and then we both came to state board at some point in our career, but we've got a lot of experience both with the state and with the regional boards. We both also have quite a bit of experience doing permitting, mostly in the water rights arena, but I also did water quality permitting when I was at the Lahontan Regional Board. And I think it's fair to say that we're both pretty big advocates and believers in general permits and general orders because of the increased efficiency and equity and consistency that they bring. But we also both understand and acknowledge that not everybody is, a huge believer in general permits. I think in part because when you create consistency and try to create a permit that applies statewide, you obviously are going to sacrifice flexibility to some extent. And so, it's not all upside. There can be a downside. I'm going to talk today a little bit at a very high level about the Bay Delta Plan and voluntary agreements, not because I want to cover voluntary agreements or the Bay Delta Plan per se, but I want to talk about the habitat restoration elements of the voluntary agreements. And I hope in talking about that, I can convey to you all some of the reasons why we think moving from sort of an individualized approach to permitting to more of a general expedited approach is going to be important moving forward. So just for context, the little bit I'll say on the Bay Delta Plan is that the State Water Board has been in the process of updating the Bay Delta Plan for well over a decade now. We last did a comprehensive update in 1995, and since that time, there's been continued decline of the ecosystem, both in terms of estuarine species decline and several threatened and endangered species, and also in the watersheds to the Delta, salmon declines that have occurred even since we last updated the plan. The board at the end of 2018 actually did do an update establishing new flow objectives for the San Joaquin River and its major tributaries, the Stanislaus, Tuolumne, and Merced rivers, and for the lower San Joaquin River itself. At that time, we also updated the salinity water quality objectives for the Southern Delta. We actually relaxed those salinity water quality objectives because it was determined that the higher numbers would be adequate to protect the agricultural use. We're currently in the process of implementing, we're in the early stages of implementing that 2018 plan amendment. The amendment to the plan established the objectives, but to implement those objectives, it requires changes or modifications to water rights. And so we've started that process. We started the early CEQA scoping for that. And likewise, we're also in the process of establishing new water quality or new flow objectives for the Delta itself, the larger Bay Delta, and then the Sacramento River and its contributing watersheds. So that includes the major watersheds. It would be the Feather, the Yuba, the American, the McCollumney, probably leaving a couple out, but basically it's the larger portion of the Bay Delta watershed itself and the Bay Delta. And so again, we're in the process of establishing those flow objectives and updating the plan, the Bay Delta plan, to address ecosystem needs in that portion of the Delta. At the same time that the board has been working on updating and implementing the Bay Delta plan, the administration has been working with public water agencies to establish what are called voluntary agreements. The board itself would not be like a signatory or a participant in voluntary agreements because the idea is that the administration with the public water agencies would bring these voluntary agreements for consideration to the board, and the board potentially could update the plan in a manner where the voluntary agreement served as the program of implementation for any updated water quality objectives. So the general premise behind voluntary agreements is that at the state board, our strongest tools revolve around bringing increased flows. So we have a lot of really, good authorities that we can bring to bear to adopt new flow objectives and then to implement those flow objectives and increase flows. And there's a lot of science and data that demonstrates when you increase flows, you will see species improvement in ecosystem response. However, we don't have great tools around requiring new habitat and other sort of non-flow actions, and that's where voluntary agreements come into play. Although we don't have strong tools to require these other non-flow actions, if parties get together and propose these actions on their own, we can accept them as part of our program of implementation and incorporate them into the Bay Delta Plan update. And so the idea behind voluntary agreements is that flow is good, but flow alone won't solve the problem entirely because the habitat of the Bay Delta has been significantly modified. And if you can bring together the combination of both flow and habitat in a package, you could potentially have equal or even greater benefits than you'd achieve with just flow alone. And you could do it at a lower water cost. So there's a benefit to the water agencies that would be affected by new flow objectives if they could propose this combination of flow and habitat and not have to give up as much water. And that's basically sort of the underlying premise behind the voluntary agreements. And that's really all I'm going to say about the Bay Delta Plan and voluntary agreements. If we could go to the next slide, I wanted to focus on the habitat components of the voluntary agreements. And so this table is it actually comes directly out of an MOU that was signed by a large number of the public water agencies in March of this year, as well as the administration, again, not the water board, but California Natural Resources Agency and Cal EPA all signed on to this memorandum of understanding, which isn't a legal agreement per se, but it's a commitment from these public water agency general managers to bring the voluntary agreements for consideration of their boards. And as part of that MOU, there was a detailed term sheet that laid out the parameters of the voluntary agreements. And there were also appendices to that term sheet. And one of the appendices was a habitat appendix. And this table comes directly from Appendix 2 of the term sheet for the voluntary agreements. And what it shows is the commitments from the public water agencies and the state for habitat in all of the watersheds that I mentioned earlier, including the Delta itself. And it is a landscape scale change here that we're looking at. And I'm not going to go through each element, but what I did do is I just kind of summarized by category. If you add this all up, what you're looking at. And for enhanced or new spawning area, it's 155 acres. For in-stream habitat, so this is in-stream juvenile rearing habitat, it's 270 acres. For floodplain habitat, 22,000 acres of new or enhanced floodplain. For tidal marsh in the Bay Delta itself, tidal marsh and floodplain habitat, it's 5,300 acres. And then for food production, it's 20,000 acres. And what these food production projects are essentially flooding up lands that currently are not flooded all the time, letting the water sit on those lands for a certain period of time to grow zooplankton, and then pumping that water back into the river to provide food for salmon. And these floodplain or food production projects are sort of bringing to scale some pilot scale projects that UC Davis and other partners have been working on that demonstrates if you can basically provide more food for juvenile salmon, they'll grow bigger, they'll grow stronger, and they'll be more likely to have success making it out through the Delta into the ocean and then come back and returning to spawn. But obviously these projects, especially these food production projects where you're bringing water onto lands that may have been irrigated, letting it sit and then pumping it back, are going to have some water quality considerations that are going to have to be taken into account. The main point I want to make here is that these restoration projects are on a scale that personally I haven't really seen before, and it's going to create quite a bit of work in terms of permitting for the regional boards and potentially for the state board as well. And it's it's just projects on this scale that I don't think we've seen before. And I guess there's just a message here of, get ready. These things are coming your way, and they're going to create a workload for sure. And there's going to be a lot of emphasis and desire to move them quickly. If we could go to the next slide. I just wanted to demonstrate, this is the costs for the different elements of the VA. And so for fallowing, the cost is at 268 million. For science and governance, 128 million. For flow, 1.3 billion. And then again for habitat, $858 million. And not all the funding has been fully identified to cover all of these costs, but a large majority of it has. So not only is there a commitment from public water agencies and the administration behind getting these projects done, but there's also money. And if we go to the next slide, this is just a clause that comes right out of the term sheet for the voluntary agreements, and I think it's just worth reading, although it's a bit of text. But what it says is, to expedite the completion of these projects, the state will commit to establish a new multidisciplinary restoration unit with authority to coordinate and work collaboratively to obtain all permits required to implement the restoration activities. This unit will track and permit these projects and seek to encourage encourage coordination between and among state and federal agencies. 2, avoid repetitive steps in the permitting process. 3, avoid conflicting conditions of approval and permit terms. And this is the one I really wanted to highlight. 4, provide an expedited path to elevate and resolve permitting challenges. So again, the message here is that there's going to be a lot of projects coming your way. This mainly pertains to Region 5 and Region 2, because that's where these projects are. And there's money behind them, and there is a strong support from the administration to get these done. The voluntary agreement has an 8-year term. The table that I put up earlier, when you break that down, we think it's going to equate to about 200 projects over that 8-year term. The project's going to have to get built before the 8-year term expires, because they're going to have to be tested to see if the voluntary agreement is working. And so there's just going to be tremendous pressure to move these projects quickly and efficiently through our processes. And although it's going to be a huge challenge, it's also going to be a huge opportunity, because frankly, these are the types of projects that we want to see happening. I mean, these are habitat restoration projects, and the thought is that they will support the fish and wildlife beneficial use. And so, it's a good opportunity, and we need to figure out ways to make them happen. I'm not saying we ignore water quality concerns, but there's going to be a lot of pressure to move through these. And if I was sitting in your shoes, I'd be thinking to myself, that's all well and good, but what we need to move these through are people to get them done. And we completely get that. It's on our radar. We're working on that. But if I'm being completely honest, we're moving into, difficult economic times right now. Things, are looking like, the overall economy is clearly decelerating. And I think it's going to be very challenging to secure the resources that we really need in terms of human resources to do this work. And so that's why relying on some of the new tools that Division of Water Quality has been working on, that Phil Crater is going to talk about, I think are so critical. And I would really encourage you to learn about the large habitat permit that Phil's going to talk about, that was recently adopted, and really embrace the use of that permit, and talk to your staff about embracing the use of that permit. And so I'm going to turn it over to Phil, and he's going to talk about some of these tools they've been working on.
Thanks, Eric, for the introduction. Good morning, everybody. For those of you who I haven't met, it's nice to meet you. I'm Phil Crater, Assistant and Deputy Director with Division of Water Quality, and I work on our statewide permitting and policy development. And I'm here today to talk to you about things that we're doing to expedite permitting of projects that we all agree are good projects and we want to move more quickly. And I'm going to talk to you about some process things that we're doing in general. And then specifically, I'm going to touch on 3 permits that Dee Dee mentioned and kind of walk through them. I've got a lot of notes and a lot of things written in my presentation. It's more words on a page than I generally like, but I wanted to leave you with something that you could take because I'm going to be moving through this pretty quickly today. And one final note, the remarks from Eric really focused heavily on a workload that's coming into region to our Bay Area region and our Central Valley region. You guys are up. Message of hope is we have some tools for you, but there's also an opportunity for the rest of the region. So don't tune out. We're investing ourselves in developing these programmatic approaches to permitting. And we're not limiting ourselves to the Central Valley and the San Francisco region. We're trying to develop tools that will work statewide. We're working closely with the roundtables, so all your program staff. We're working with your executive management. We're doing a lot of internal communicating before we release anything to the public to make sure that we're doing our best to strike the balance between streamlining and protecting water quality. And so I want to, for those of you who are aware of what we're doing, thank you for your support. And for those of you who aren't, hopefully I can encourage you. My goals today, if we could jump to the next slide, are to make sure you're aware of what we're doing, again, both process and a few specific projects. And then I'm asking for your support. So your support to implement some of the projects that we've already, or the permits that we've already developed, as well as your support to get your staff to engage with us on permits that we're working on, again, to make these as useful as possible. So if we can jump to the next slide, please. So I'm going to focus on a very quick distinction between our permitting approaches today. I'm going to talk about individual permits, and I'm going to talk about programmatic permits, and then I'm going to focus on our statewide restoration general order in depth a little bit, and then move more quickly through our vegetation management order and our forthcoming utility general order, and we'll leave plenty of time for discussion and questions at the end. If we could jump, you did jump to the next. I can't see. I'm sorry. If it looks like I'm staring you down, I'm trying to read the. I'm trying to read the screen back there to make sure you guys are. So this is probably a lot of familiar territory for many of you, but for those of you who it isn't, we have 2 general permitting approaches that we use at the Water Board when we permit. What people typically think of as a permit is an individual permit. And that is where an applicant describes a project in an application. They file an individual application to us. We get the application, we review it, we request information from the applicant. We get the information that we need in order to make the findings that we need to issue a permit. That process can take months on a very optimistic timeline, more often than not years, for us to issue a permit. And they tend to be very costly to the applicant because if the project is subject to CEQA, the applicant has to develop the CEQA document for that project. And so this is probably what we spend most of our staff hours working on right now, is processing individual permits. It's not the most efficient way to do it. As Eric mentioned, it does recognize that some projects have unique challenges and they're just best suited to an individual permit. So I just want to leave that on the table. We're never going to cover everything that we want to with general permits. There is a place for individual permits, but the shift today is to focus, or the focus today is to shift from individual permits to programmatic permits. For programmatic permits, we develop the permit here at the Water Board, either at the state board or at the regional water board. We do our homework in advance. We have conversations with stakeholders to talk about what scope would be most useful, and we try and make it as expansive as possible without avoiding getting overly broad. So we develop the permit in advance. Once the permit is developed, we make it available, and applicants come forward and they enroll in the permit. So they file a brief application to enroll. These applications, because they're for a specific type of project that we've already developed a permit for, tend to be much easier for us to process. And so instead of months or years, now we're talking, in some cases, days for one of the permits I'll talk to you about today, or weeks, maybe months to process, but much, much more quick. And they're a lot less costly to an applicant because we have to go through the CEQA process when we develop the permit. So it doesn't leave a CEQA document for an applicant. That CEQA document's a problem for us, and it's the reason that we don't develop more programmatic permits, because we don't have the resources to develop the CEQA documents. So the permits that I'm going to go over today, there's kind of a common theme where we've received outside assistance with the CEQA documents. That's helpful. We certainly want to figure out ways to do more of these internally if we can, just so we can keep moving on these. And so between the individual and programmatic permit, we obviously favor the programmatic approach when we're trying to streamline. Next slide, please. This is just a quick list. I'm going to move through this. These are the 3 programmatic permits that I'm going to touch on, and I'm going to shift now to the next slide, talking about the statewide restoration general order. This is the permit that we're going to look to hopefully do the lion's share of permitting for the voluntary agreements. The purpose of the permit is to expedite consultation, authorization, and permitting of eligible projects that help the state achieve habitat restoration, species recovery, and water quality improvement goals. So some background about the permit. It supports a number of administration initiatives. And so we're getting a lot of push on these. And that push is really helpful because it gets folks to the core of the issues when we have discussions about scope and protections. It supports the Cutting the Green Tape initiative, which hopefully you're all familiar with. If you're not familiar with it, it's just do more good work quickly. The 30 by 30 initiative, and then Eco Restore, which is it's a companion program that has a number of habitat projects throughout the Central Valley that are going to be implemented. They are early actions, and so they're not waiting for voluntary agreements or flow settlements or other action from the water board. There are no regrets projects that they are already working on. Thus far, we've been working with Region 5 and Region 2 on projects on an individual basis. And I want to thank Patrick for your team and Region 5 board members. Your team in Region 2 has been excellent at communicating with the permittees and turning around these projects quickly. But I think Patrick can attest to the draw on the staff to do these fast response individual permits. It's not sustainable. So I've got flagged on here in the background that we were directed to adopt and implement this permit quickly. Our board and the administration made it clear that delay would not be tolerated here. And again, that got folks to the table talking. It was a helpful push. We received assistance with our CEQA document. We have, as Dee Dee mentioned, a small habitat restoration program that we've used for years. It's a general order with limitations of 500 linear feet or 5 acres. So anything bigger than that, we can't use it. Moreover, projects have to qualify for a specific CEQA exemption to use that, and if they don't, they're out. So that permit is great, but it's got limited utility. We've seen a need to expand for years. We've been unable to do so. Sustainable Conservation is a group that has the finances and the expertise to assist us in preparing CEQA documents, and they approached us and asked if we would partner with them. We gladly did, and it was an excellent exercise. It involved extensive collaboration, and I'm flagging it here because it's so critical. We worked closely with Cal EPA, with the Natural Resources Agency, with all the water boards, with Department of Water Resources and Fish and Wildlife, with a number of restoration groups and NGOs, and had some really good conversations about what's the appropriate scope and where do we strike that balance with recognizing the need to move quickly with, balancing that with the need to make good decisions, not just rushing to make any decision. And I'm proud of where we landed. We've got a permit that's a 401 water quality certification, and I just changed slides on you. I can't see if I think you did too. Thank you. Okay. We developed a permit that's a combination 401 certification and waste discharge requirement. It establishes a single application that an applicant can use statewide, and that's particularly useful for this type of a permit because a lot of the practitioners that we're working with on restoration, they do work statewide, and it's hard for them to learn every region's application process. So this makes it consistent. The order that we developed includes permit conditions and design guidelines, and they not only work for us, but they're conditions and guidelines that work for other agencies' approval requirements too. And the thought there was if somebody's going to go through our hoops to get our permit, let's get them through as many other hoops as possible. And so we worked with Department of Fish and Wildlife, with Fish and Wildlife Service, with Sustainable Conservation, because they've been reaching out to some of the other groups to find out what these requirements were and to try and cover as many of them as possible. And lastly, the CEQA document that we prepared worked entirely for our effort, but if somebody brings forward a project that maybe doesn't fit exactly with the general order and needs some additional work, our document's a really good head start for them. So we're providing people tools to advance projects, whether they fit under our general order, or even if they do need an individual order, at least giving them a big head start. The definition of a restoration project that we're talking about is one that would result in a net increase in aquatic or riparian resource area functions and or services through implementation of the eligible project types, the relevant general protection measures, which are those conditions that I was talking about, and consideration of design guidelines. And this definition is important because each region gets to determine whether or not a project meets that definition in order to determine whether or not it's eligible to be covered. So this is a safeguard. We've left that with the regions. And it requires that any project be consistent with the applicable basin plan requirements. So moving on, we have a list here of the eligible project types. I'm not going to read them all, but this is in here for your reference. If you scan through this, what you'll see is, or if you skim through it, you'll see that this is a pretty broad suite of restoration activities. These are generally, I think we can all agree, the types of things that we want to see more of. We want to see them happen. These are all covered by this order. So what's the status of the order? Our board adopted it in August of this year. We're currently working to conform the final documents, get everything ADA accessible, get it posted up to our website. We've actually had a number of emails and phone calls from practitioners who are looking to use the thing. We don't want them to wait. So in the meantime, we're making the documents available to applicants, and you should be aware in case you hear of any projects in your regions. If it's not available, please just have them reach out to us. We'll get them all the information they need. The permit is adopted. It's in effect. We're just going through some administrative cleanup. And moving forward, we're going to continue to coordinate with the regions and with Department of Fish and Wildlife to make sure we're doing the best job that we can preparing for these things in advance and then moving through and processing them. So this thing is a really good tool for any of the regions to use to expedite permitting for projects that fit cleanly within this. It could be a really quick turnaround and a very low effort review for your staff. That's what I have to cover on this, and I'm happy to spend as much time as you want talking about these. I would like to maybe get through the next two. I don't know if you're doing questions at the end or not, but if not, I'm going to transition to two permits that relate to veg. Okay.
Yeah, folks can keep submitting written comments if they have, or questions if they have them as you're presenting. We'll do it all at the end.
Okay,
thank you, Phil.
Yeah, I'm gonna switch really quickly in less detail here to two programmatic permits that we're working on to help address our issues that we're having with wildfire in California. You may have heard about this. It's been in the news a little bit. So the first permit that I wanted to talk about is our vegetation treatment general order. This is a really cool permit. It's meant to facilitate the streamlined management of hazard vegetation to reduce wildfire risk within the state responsibility area. If that's an unfamiliar term to you, that's the area where CAL FIRE is the primary emergency response agency. So it's a large chunk of California, but it's certainly not all of California. There's more land outside of the state responsibility area than in. This is an initial effort. We have more to do. And this permit is supposed to allow this streamlined management while protecting water quality. We had a lot of discussion about that. Background on the order: in 2018, there was an executive order that set a goal of treating 500,000 acres per year of vegetation to reduce wildfire risk. That's a lot, and this stuff grows back. So even, you treat it, in a few years, you're gonna need to go back and treat it again. So we need to be ready for this. CAL FIRE is administering money to do this. There's a lot of money out there. People are taking the money and they're doing the work. So there's local, state, and federal agencies who are spearheading these projects. They are on board, increasing the pace and scale throughout California. We know that means there are going to be a lot of permits required because these activities have the potential to impact water quality. We don't want to be an impediment to those permits. So we talked about what can we do to move these things forward as quickly as possible. Where we landed was Board of Forestry and Fire Protection was developing a programmatic EIR. So again, this theme of somebody else doing the SQL work. Board of Forestry and Fire Protection was lead. They reached out to us, thankfully, very early on. We worked with the regional boards, in particular regions 1, 5, and 6, who have a lot of our forested areas, to sit down with the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection and talk about what we wanted to see in an environmental impact report for our permitting needs. We made it clear to them we were working in good faith. This was going to be our one bite at the apple. We made that clear to our state and regional board staff that were working on it too, that you need to take a look at it now and decide what we need and really decide, is it a fight that we want to have? Or is it something where we can step back a little bit and have a lighter touch to streamline? The staff were awesome. We had that conversation with Board of Forestry and Fire Protection. They did a great job on the EIR. It worked. We didn't have any additional comments on it once it was released. We were able to develop a permit that supported the goals of the vegetation, the Cal VTP, which is the Vegetation Treatment Program, and our board adopted that permit. There's two really novel things that I want to talk about with this permit. One is a notion of automatic enrollment. And so an applicant submits an application to the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection, whose staff looks at it to determine whether or not it's a qualifying project. If it's a qualifying project, they notify us. We've got this applicant and they transmit the application material to us. We take that information, do a quick cursory check on a few things, and draft up a letter saying, congratulations, applicant, you're enrolled in this order. They may not even know the order existed or that they needed it, but we're doing all the work for them. We're enrolling them. And the second novel piece is that we were given general fund money to cover the work, so there's no fee. Our task here was to remove all administrative hurdles, all barriers to entry for landowners to do vegetation management in California and try and get ahead of wildfire. So clearing this administrative and this cost hurdle here has opened it up. We're getting applications in. I see them come to me for my stage in the approval within days of being received here at the Water Board. So this is actually one where we are turning these around within days or at the most weeks of receiving them. The permit that we issue is good for 10 years. So it allows an applicant to get out and retreat, and it requires them to notify us if they're going to be making any changes. So really, really proud of the work that all of us did on this one. The status of this is that it's been adopted, and we're working closely with the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection to triage applications as they come in. Once we get them, we're working with your staff. We administer the letter. That goes out to your team, and we're looking to the teams to get out and inspect these these projects, and then if necessary, follow up with the applicants to make sure that they're doing what they need to do. This is one where we're acutely aware of the need for resources. What we're able to do right now is streamline the administration of it, and we do have staff available at the State Water Board that can pair up with your staff to get out and do inspections in the field. That's that one. The last one I want to talk to you about today is our forthcoming utility corridor general order. This is intended to be a streamlined permit for electrical utilities that conduct wildfire mitigation, so post-fire work, and then also operation and maintenance activities. In 2018, Senate Bill 901 was signed. It aims to increase the pace and scale of this work, and it requires utility companies that operate in high threat areas to prepare plans and then implement plans that describe how they're going to reduce risk of ignitions from their facilities. And as you've seen, probably a lot of the big fires that we've had lately, a number of them unfortunately have been linked to starts from utility infrastructure. So this is an important project, and these activities do have the impact to discharge waste, so we know we need to issue a permit. The permit scope and details, there's a couple of pages here. I'm not going to go through all the different types of activities, but again, this is a project where we worked closely with our staff, with the regional board staff, and with the utility companies to ask them, what types of work do you need to do in order to get in and respond to wildfire and do your line hardening? And they gave us a list. We went through it and tried to incorporate as many of those activities into this permit as we could. One that I want to flag in here, the third bullet down, site access, development, and maintenance, is one that we are working on very carefully because this has to do with road maintenance and road building, which is really getting into these areas, probably the single highest threat to water quality. It also needs to happen. They have to get in there. And if we don't give them some way of doing it, they're just going to get in and push a blade across a landscape. And we've already seen that happening. So this is important. There are concerns about it. I want to let you know that we hear the concerns and we're working closely with your staff to try and develop measures to address that. So the next couple pages all contain these different types of activities. In terms of the status of this order, we just released a notice of preparation on it. We've gone through the scoping exercise that closed in March of this year. Since then, we have withdrawn back to the office and really taken a close look at the comments that we received about what activities should be covered. And we're working with the regional boards and our council here internally to make sure that we're developing measures that address those. We are looking to release the draft permit in February of 2023. And if we do that, going through the public process, that brings us to a proposed adoption a year from now in October of 2023, which unfortunately puts us out after the close of next fire season. If there's things that we can do to move the pace up on that, we're going to. But also, this is one where I'm looking to you for your support in developing the permit, really helping us work with your staff to be very selective about where we're picking our fights. So that's the end of that third permit. And with that, I'm going to take a breath. Thank you all for your attention and open it up to any questions or discussion.
Best take a breath now, because I don't think you've been able to take one these past couple of years, given just all the great work that you've been doing, Phil. I know it is you and your team and the regional board staff, and it really is a collective effort, but just thanks for really leading and pushing. Because when you think about so many of the theoretical streamlining discussions that may be happening, this scope of work is some of the most significant that's going on in the state and around some of our highest priorities around wildfire. And here, the ability to strike that right balance between being better decision makers, seeing our programs and our work as the opportunity to ensure that we don't we do what we did in the past, which was maybe not make the best decisions because they weren't as well informed, but balance that with the urgency of the scope of the challenges we're facing is no easy feat. And so just thanks everyone for that work. It means a lot, because the worst thing that we can do is let that sense of urgency let us make a whole scope of other bad decisions again, and just compound the challenges that we're facing anyway. Questions? I know I have a written one here, and then otherwise folks can continue to submit written ones or flag a verbal one they have. We have a question that's what legislative efforts have been made to expand CEQA, section 15333 exemptions to not only address small habitat, but rather large-scale habitat projects?
That's a really good question. I might look to Michael Loffer to bail me out if he's aware of any efforts. I know in general, our approach to this has been to try and work with the CEQA exemptions as they stand and do the best that we can, because legislation is kind of outside of our scope. And so we're trying to work with the rules that we have. But Michael, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, it's certainly been a point of discussion, and in the context of the voluntary agreements that Eric referenced, certainly there were a number of parties there who wanted to look at lots of different flexibility, not only for the large scale projects, but also for smaller projects they see coming down the road. And like so many CEQA exemptions, as Phil alluded to, they kind of start down the process and very few of them make it across the finish line. Although I will say really the last 10 years, but in particular the last 3 or 4 years, there's been lots of clever CEQA exemptions that walk like a duck, quack like a duck, but they don't call it a CEQA exemption. So. But I'm not sure we'll see much. A lot of this is really geared on trying to make a lot of these projects fit into these big buckets that we're creating, and to do it in a streamlined, effective way without calling out special CEQA exemptions.
Thanks, Michael. And I will speculate that may have been asked about, or just see if there was a way of expanding the scope of the small habitat restoration general order. We can get at that outside of CEQA, and that's actually one of the things that we are considering right now is expanding the scope of that by looking at that 500 linear foot limitation that's in there. That's not in my understanding. That's not in CEQA. Is that that's in our permit, and the CEQA document relates to our permit as the gatekeeper for the activity. And so we do, I think, have the ability to do that. That's not something that we take lightly, and we need to talk to the regional boards and the Department of Fish and Wildlife about doing it. But it is an option that's out on the table, and there's been a push to do that.
Thank you both. This is really encouraging, and I know there's a great deal of hard work involved. And we were very much aware in Board 2 of the urgency on the statewide restoration order. I'm really glad to see that be in place. I'm trying to unlock the recesses of my mind to the early days of sediment TMDLs and ask the general question, when the state board, decades after adoption of sediment TMDLs, puts in place general permits like this, if I'm not misconstruing it, what do we do with the allocations in sediment TMDLs when there's a new potential discharge? Is the TMDL just going to exist in a separate world and it doesn't affect this? It's not a critical question. I just can't figure out how, after the fact, you translate the load allocation from a TMDL from long ago into a source that now exists potentially at the time that you didn't consider when you did the TMDL.
That's a good question, and it's one that we grapple with a lot when we're updating our statewide general orders. The particular orders that I've talked to about today just require compliance with basin plans, and there's some tools in there for regional boards to require controls. For other permits that we update, some of our statewide general orders, NPDES permits, for example, we have a lot of TMDLs that need to be incorporated explicitly. And so as we go through and update those on a periodic basis, we update the permit at the time and draw it in so that when we adopt the permit, it kind of sets a stop. And when we go back and revise the permit, it reopens it. So there can be a lag. And in particular, like for some of our NPDES permits where we sometimes exceed the 5-year limit, there can be long periods of time where an adopted TMDL is not implemented in the permit. Does that answer your question, or am I?
I think I'm just needing to catch.
I think Patrick.
I'm needing to catch myself up, and I'm going to turn to Patrick. I just think that when I think back, like to some of the board one TMDLs for sediment that we worked on, there were mostly WDR-like implementation mechanisms, not NPDES permits. And I'm just thinking it's not a big deal. I just don't know how you go back to an old TMDL that maybe people don't even remember when there's a new, very efficient new mechanism. But let me hand to you.
No, I think, and we've confronted those issues less with sediment, but there's a couple TMDLs out there that are legacy TMDLs where the technology has moved beyond where we were, or the scientific understanding of what's causing the water quality problem has moved beyond. And, you know, the unfortunate situation is it is considered a standards action whenever you have to modify those, and you have to walk through a modification of the TMDL and the basin plan. The only kind of silver lining is that you almost have your substitute environmental documentation already prepared for you. And so that shaves a lot of the effort off of the process. But to the extent that you have to modify controls that aren't delineated in the programmatic ER, you have to go back in and do some supplemental environmental work to make that work, which is, it is what it is. US EPA tends to be very open to those because it's newer, better. But it's stepping through the substitute environmental document component that's the challenge.
Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick.
I can add to that from Region 1's perspective. With regard to implementation of sediment TMDLs, I mean, as an example, we used to refer to sediment controls for what we called legacy sediment sites, as Patrick was just alluding to, and we're now evolving to refer to them as controllable sediment discharge sources. So moving from that concept of just controlling sites from historic sources to requirements to address any sediment source that's controllable, regardless of when it was initiated and when it could have an impact on water quality. And so as we're developing new permits, like our private timber permits or federal lands permits, they're required to address both those legacy sources that are still out there waiting to discharge, as well as new sources that are created through whatever the land use activity, whether it's timber harvest or road networks and things like that. While I have the mic, I wanted to just, if I may, thank Eric and Phil for your great presentation, and for the coordination with the regions on these three really important general orders, which we certainly very much support. North Coast Region was glad to participate in the development of both the Restoration General Order and the Vegetation Treatment Order. With regard to the Restoration Order, North Coast Region in, I think it was 2012, developed a policy statement in support of restoration, recognizing, going to your point, Eric, waste discharge control alone won't result in protection of all beneficial uses, and you need active restoration. So our restoration policy, as we refer to it, kind of supported that concept. And so then having tools like the general restoration order is just is a great tool for advancing restoration in the North Coast region. So we're looking forward to using it more and more. Just want to make a plug on the vegetation treatment order. You mentioned that it addresses the state responsibility area, and you said kind of look ahead that there's lots of other lands needing vegetation treatment outside of the state responsibility area. And just the plug that that's going to need to be very much a state and regional board coordinated effort when we move into expanding vegetation treatment into the federal land management areas. Thanks.
Thank you. And I want to respond. First of all, I'm hesitant to call out names because then I leave other really awesome folks out of it. But since we're talking Region 1, I do want to thank you for your team. John Warmerdam has been incredible resource to us in our wildfire and in our restoration work. So really appreciate his support and your region's support. And in terms of the next steps for the veg management order, I did allude to work to be done. We have initiated and then put on pause an effort to develop an order similar to the vegetation management general order for federal lands, local lands, for other lands that aren't currently covered. The requirements could be very much the same. Unfortunately, we don't have CEQA documentation to do it, and our resources like yours are all tied up developing permits and working on other really high priority work. So while that's something that we want to do, we just don't have the resources to do it at the moment, but we recognize the need and are looking to some of the non-point source work that's going on in Region 1, 5, and 6 to kind of guide us once we're ready to pick that up and move on it. So thank you.
Do we have any more questions? We do still have about 8 minutes of time on this panel. If anyone has any other questions or thoughts. There's nothing written currently. And so if there aren't any questions in the room, we can move on our agenda as well and create a little time. Thanks again. Really appreciate the great discussion. So what we will now transition to is our last discussion with Amel, Michael Loffer, and apologies. I know there's one more.
Jennifer Fordyce.
Jennifer, thank you, Ms. Fordyce. And what I will note now is if you go to the online app we've been using through the QR code, there's now a poll question. And as we kind of come to our last hour here of WQCC and we have this discussion, did want to create the space for specific ideas around what regional board members and others would like to see around specific follow-up over the next year. I think it would be good to best kind of pull together what those ideas may be. And what I'd like to do is one, as a follow-up, all the slides that we saw today will be provided to everybody. So you will have those. Likewise, what I'll make sure we do is synthesize the questions that we've received all through this. The ones that we were able to answer here in the discussion, I won't emphasize as much, but we'll try to get written responses for those that we didn't. And then as part of that, maybe something of an action memo or something where we kind of lay out the sorts of ideas we're provided and kind of select a few. And it can be a discussion for the chairs, maybe at our next call, with consultation with the rest of the regional board members, what specifically we would like to see as follow-up to the next year from these discussions and as we run up to the next WQCC. Before we also transition, I just want to say incredible thanks to Meredith Thompson, Margie Argel, Michael Reed, and everyone else that has made today possible. This, be careful, with success comes expectations. And this has been such a successful discussion that we'll just look forward to continued. So thank you so much. This wouldn't have happened without you, Meredith. And now we'll transition to our discussion. Mr. Loffer, thank you.
Thank you very much, Joaquin. Hopefully this mic is picking up all right. It seems like everybody who's been up here has been shunning it for some reason. there are some snacks over there. I don't want anyone crashing out on their blood sugar right now. I know we're running into the lunch hour, and we've got as I mentioned yesterday, a relatively brief period of time for the legal session, and we've tried to minimize the actual set piece because this session, historically, the most value that's come from it really is this is an opportunity, in this particular case, at the end of WQCC, for you all as members. You get to come here for WQCC and rub elbows, and there's tremendous value from that. The over the cup of coffee exchanges that occur, but also the legal session has been a forum where you can raise sort of those off the wall questions that come up over the year. That can be answered with some legal guidance, but a lot of times I think the most valuable discussions have been simply the best practices that we walk through collectively or that are shared by your fellow colleagues. And so with that spirit, I'd like folks to kind of keep those things in mind. I will stay here as long as possible. We don't need to take the full hour, but I'm happy to do so and expect we will based on questions in the past. I have a very small little set piece that's going to cover two discrete issues. One has to do with Bagley-Keene, and then the other has to do with records. Always a incredibly boring and dry subject for everybody, but they're incredibly important. And there's some lessons that other agencies and we have learned over the last year that I want to make sure. But just kind of food for thought for everybody as I work through this piece, and then I'm going to hand it off to Amel for just a very kind of a preview of coming attractions on a recent piece of legislation that will take effect on January 1 and affect the findings that the water boards collectively have to make on environmental justice, tribal community, and disadvantaged community issues in a lot of their plans. So it's kind of a preview of coming attractions. But before I start that set piece, I just want to plant some seeds. I mean, the types of things that people have wanted to talk through in the past and have raised questions on, ranged the subject from meeting management, ex parte communications, conflicts of interest, executive officer performance reviews, and executive officer hiring, that sort of thing. So, if you have questions that have come up over the year, certainly kind of park those for now and we'll pick them up at the end of the set piece. First up, Bagley-Keene. I want to correct one slightly overbroad misstatement from Morgan Carvala yesterday from the governor's office when she said we'd gone back to the pre-COVID world with respect to Bagley-Keene. And I think you all know, and especially looking over my shoulder at Mr. Stahl and the other board members who are participating remotely, we still, at least for the next 3/4 of a year, are able to take advantage of some flexibility, not from COVID-19 emergency suspensions from the governor's office, but instead by legislative action that gives us some additional flexibility under the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act to allow you all as members to participate remotely. In fact, if you wanted to, you could go back to fully remote meetings, but I do want to have a little bit of a caution on that. The State Water Board has set an expectation, and I think the chairs kind of affirmed that when we had the chairs meeting earlier this year, that even though this temporary flexibility under the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act that expires on July 1 of next year allows for members to all participate remotely, we think there's incredible value to providing these remote platforms, but have been setting the expectation that all the water boards, the State Water Board, the regional water boards, the WQCC, will provide a physical meeting location where we will have members present and we will entertain comments from members of the public. And we expect that to continue through July 1 of next year. Now, some of you may be aware that July 1 date was basically a legislative compromise back in June to kick the can because the legislature and the executive branch have not yet come to terms on what a long-term flexible Bagley-Keene exception would be to allow board member participation remotely. I'd like to think that unlike the shorter term extension they did last year, that by giving themselves a year, there would have been a lot of progress. But frankly, so far in the last 6 months, we haven't really seen any public movement on what a long-term exception will look like. But regardless of whether or not that flexibility expires on July 1, another expectation that we continue to have that the State Water Board members have set and that has been sort of conveyed out, and I think the regions both at WQCC last year as well as through the chairs this year, is that we will continue to use platforms like Zoom to allow members of the public to participate, even if the board members all have to be in the same room, or use the very narrow teleconference exceptions that are enshrined in Bagley-Keene. We are going to continue to allow members of the public in far-flung parts of the state to participate remotely in our meetings using Zoom. It's been a great democratizing force that we have had. It has made not only for easier participation, I know it at times has made for some longer meetings, but I think the boards and some of the other state agencies have done a remarkable job figuring out how to run these Zoom meetings efficiently and to get a lot of testimony in a relatively confined period of time. We're also open to, and I mentioned this at last year's WQCC, looking at new and novel tools like setting up remote hearing rooms so that if we have a disadvantaged community that we recognize that not everyone has broadband, we set up tools that they can use phone lines, but that we will, essentially in the right circumstances, be prepared to deploy a remote hearing room where we can take a community's testimony on a specific issue concerning them, and they don't have to travel as far, but they can still have the full wonder of technology that we're able to take advantage of in our own hearing rooms. So we will continue going down those routes, and I think we are better for it. We're hearing a lot more stakeholders, and I think I haven't pulled all the EOs recently, but I know based on our experience at the state board, we've kind of seen it settle out. I think there was a lot of novelty where we heard people who would come repeatedly on the same issues because they no longer had to drive 3 hours to come to our meeting and vent in public forum. And I feel that the meetings are getting a little bit, that's kind of gone by the wayside a little bit. We still have a few, but we don't have as many of the folks who just are participating and talking to repeat the same points they made at a prior meeting. Pivoting now to records. I beat this dead horse almost at every WQCC ever since we were able to deploy email addresses for all the regional board members. I will start by saying I recognize that you all have lives outside of the water board. You have professional lives, personal lives. You have probably 3 or 4 different emails. And the last thing that most of you wanted was a water board email as well. And so I'm sympathetic to adding on another email address, but I need to emphasize once again, and folks are doing a great job. I know it's still hard for a few folks, but it is incredibly important that when you're conducting water board business, that you use that water board email address. It allows us to retain the record. It allows us to not have to intrude into your private email address in order to go and look for business related to the water boards. And it just increases transparency and accountability and provides a strong measure of assurances to the public that you are doing your public business on public resources. Over the last 10 years, ever since the Supreme Court clarified this issue, we have seen a growing number of Public Records requests, Public Records Act requests that target specifically personal devices and personal email. As long as we can demonstrate that we have a strong practice and have no indication that board members are conducting business, we'll still ask the question. But as long as we have no indication that board members are conducting water board business on private emails, we don't have to do any direct searches on private devices. But we are getting those requests routinely. We have to do our due diligence. We'll be asking you, and it makes our lives easier if we know right off the bat, and you can provide us the assurance that that email work is being done on a water board email. We've talked previously before that sometimes you can't control what happens. You have those public lives, your email addresses, whether private or work, are exposed in Google and elsewhere, and you might receive an email. And the solution to that is, first of all, encourage folks, if they're reaching out to you about water board stuff, to use your water board email address in the future, but forward along the inbound email to your water board account so that we get a record of it and we can process it through. It will also then appropriately be destroyed after the relevant period of time. Also, sometimes we recognize that some of you are traveling and don't have access, especially because of some of the security hoops that we now have to jump through as a state email provider. And you may not be able to authenticate into your water board email account, but you think it's important to send a board-related email and
it's not convenient to make a phone call or do one of our other traditional means. If that happens and you've got to send from your private email, like we've advised in the past, and we've got it in writing in the board member packets, go ahead, send it from your private email, but just copy your water board email account. Those little basic things to deal with those edge cases will ensure that we still have the records, minimize the impact on you, and minimize the impact on the attorneys in the event that we do have work that occurs on a personal email. And again, this is not, it's not a scolding. Everyone's doing a really good job. And it's not something I'm throwing out there just because it's the law and we want it done. We are getting requests for private emails and searching of private devices routinely. And the last thing that we want to do is actually have to take it one step beyond, did you do any work on waterboard or waterboard work on a private email? Here, no. And then somebody produces an email saying, well, here's something that happened. You need to go further. And then have one of our attorneys or the AG's office having to go through your Google account or do some other forensic work. That's not where we want to be. So I appreciate everyone's help in that effort. I just feel it's important to reemphasize the point. And I want to emphasize a flip point of that. I think everybody knows that pretty much anything you put in writing and anything that you send via email is potentially discoverable under the Public Records Act. You also know that not every single bit of electronic detritus, even if it is a record, needs to be disclosed under the Public Records Act. There are a host of communications that can be appropriately, once the attorneys have done the analysis, withheld from public dissemination if we get a Public Records Act request. The classic examples are personnel matters, deliberative process matters where you're working amongst staff to reach a decision by the board, attorney-client communications, and attorney work product. Those aren't the exclusive lists, but those are some great examples. Governor's Office communication is another big example. Just because something is not disclosable because of a statutory or court-made exception to the Public Records Act request doesn't mean it will never be disclosed. There's an important concept, we attorneys call it waiver, that comes into play involving the Public Records Act. And we've had a couple issues, and our sister agencies have had a couple issues on this over the past year, 2 years in the case of the sister agencies, that I want to make sure people have a sensitivity to. If you receive something from or send to the executive officer or to the Office of Chief Counsel or some of your staff, a document that has a confidential personnel matter or attorney-client matter, you receive it, you send it either way, and then you realize or decide, I want to share this with somebody else. Your first step should always be to reach out to who sent it to you to ask whether it can be shared. And then also to identify who you intend to share it with so that we can determine whether it's appropriate to share it with that person. You should never assume that just because you've received an email and it looks innocuous, even though it may be stamped, in the best case, it's stamped confidential, or maybe it says something about personnel matters in it. Don't just blindly forward it. Don't forward it to another board member, because in certain instances, we may have matters where individual board members have a conflict and they've been recused out. Or if you're trying to forward it to other staff, that staff member may be on the other side of an ethical wall. For example, they're part of an investigation. And the sender of that email will know the scope of who the email can be shared with. And you also shouldn't assume that just because you're receiving it, that the person that you want to share it with, say, for example, another board member, didn't receive it, because a lot of times we will take advantage of the blind copy feature in emails to ensure that we don't get inadvertent Bagley-Keene violations. The main point that I want to emphasize is when you are receiving communications that are deliberative and look to be internal to the board, or receiving personnel matters or attorney-client communications, don't forward them out without checking. Because if you do forward them and you forward them to someone who may be ethically walled off because they're on an enforcement side of an equation, or if they're not part of the board, or you forward it on to a state board member. Generally, the state board member is not a participant in a regional board proceeding and may not have the same attorney-client protections, the same deliberative process protections. Before you do any of that forwarding, you really need to check in with the sender and make sure that the recipient is an appropriate recipient.
9 times out of 10, you probably shouldn't be the one forwarding it. It might be better if the original sender is the one that's sending it to make the protection even stronger. But what's the consequence if you don't? And why am I talking about this? Because as soon as you send it outside of the appropriate confidentiality bubble, the privilege is waived. And it's not just a legal concept. The Public Records Act actually enshrines it that if a record that's otherwise protected, deliberative, confidential, attorney-client, is produced to any member of the public, then if there's another response or another Public Records Act request and that record is responsive, it has to be released to them. And this can have hugely undesirable consequences. I mean, sometimes the deliberative communications are deliberative because you're trying to work through the pros and the cons and you're out identifying the weaknesses in a particular action. Sometimes it might be that it's embarrassing because frankly, on some of those most confidential communications, you're weighing pros and cons, but there may not be the precision in what's being described. And sometimes the communications that you're receiving may involve personnel matters. And even if it's a personnel matter, if it's been waived as to one person, it's potentially been waived as to all. And some of those personnel matters can be embarrassing to the individuals involved as well as to the board collectively. So I just really want to emphasize that caution. In the last year, the water boards have had to release at least a couple of records where we would not have otherwise done them, but there had been waiver. 2 of our sister agencies had a really embarrassing situation that actually played out all the way through litigation, where they had released a number of deliberative communications and they had shared them outside of their deliberative bubbles, and they had to produce them because they couldn't show that the confidential communication stayed within the confidential cone of silence, if you will. And so, these are real world problems. They are happening. The courts are very attuned to this particular issue, and I just want to make sure that all of you are, because it's not necessarily an intuitive result. And it's not intuitive in terms of the fact that you release to one, you've got to release to all, but also not intuitive that some of these shared emails really need to stay in a tight bubble, and that you may have staff because of enforcement matters who are in a different location and you can't share with them. And likewise, you may have members who are walled off, and it extends to sharing with the state water board members. It extends to sharing with Cal EPA and the governor's office. Always best to kind of double check and check back with the original sender. And I've inadvertently flipped the order that I wanted to make the second point in, which is I'll wrap up with another observation about the Public Records Act before turning it over to Mel. You have one confidential employee, and that is your executive officer. The fact that they're a confidential employee does not mean that every communication with them is confidential. And I think there's a lot of sort of, because of the nature of the relationship you have with them and you share a lot with them, especially, free form and conversations, there's sort of an assumption that you can communicate freely with the executive officer and it's going to be confidential. And that there isn't any such general exception under the Public Records Act. It's going to have to fall neatly into one of those other buckets, be it a personnel matter, a deliberative process matter. And so it's always a good opportunity to kind of step back and, pay attention to the old adage. If you don't want to see it on the front page of the newspaper the next day, don't put it in writing. But don't assume just because you're sharing with your executive officer that it's something that's not going to have to be disclosed either in response to a Public Records Act request or litigation. They're great. You can share a lot of things confidentially with them. Just think about how you do it, when you do it, and let's not get it on the front page of the Sacramento Bee. And so with that, I'll now turn it over to Amel to talk very quickly on AB 2108, which is the Revis bill.
All right, can everyone hear me? I'll back up a little, actually. So switching gears entirely, but I'll do this pretty quickly since we want to get to questions and answers. The Revis bill, AB 2108, I think some of you have followed it all along. It does take effect on January 1. Michael introduced it a little bit. It is the Water Policy, Environmental Justice, and Disadvantaged and Tribal Communities bill. Essentially, that means that the legislation is aiming to ensure a more enhanced and thoughtful process on environmental justice concerns when the water boards are exercising their planning or permitting authority. So in many ways, it's kind of formalizing some of the expectations that the water boards have been setting already over the last few years. It has several components. Some of the components are contingent on specific appropriation, and so will most likely not be in effect on January 1. Those include a environmental justice and tribal coordinator position to be established at the water boards, one or more positions, certain requirements for staff training, a stipend program to be established at the boards to allow greater civic engagement by disadvantaged and tribal communities, and the development of additional tools for compliance assessment and enforcement in disadvantaged and tribal communities. And those terms, by the way, are defined in the legislation. It has specific definitions for what a disadvantaged community is and what a tribal community is. There are two components that are not contingent on specific appropriation. I'm going to spend just a little bit more time on those two components. Well, to be clear, each have staff workload and in some ways extensive staff workload associated with them. And the water boards have submitted a proposal to the Department of Finance to try to get additional staffing to implement these components. But whether we get that additional staffing or not, these are going to be legal requirements, and we're preparing to implement them. Of the components that are not subject to appropriation, the first mandates an enhanced outreach during the board's planning and permitting processes. Specifically, its engagement in equitable and culturally relevant community outreach to promote meaningful civic engagement. And I'm picking out the terms from the legislation. When proposed discharges of waste may have disproportionate impacts on water quality in disadvantaged communities and tribal communities. We at OCC, at the Office of Chief Counsel, are working with the Office of Public Participation to try to define what some of that outreach might mean. That's one component of the work we're doing on this. So the second component requires findings, and those findings are findings regarding environmental justice concerns that are to be made by the boards in their planning and permitting actions. Specifically, there are three buckets. There's planning and policy actions, there's general permits and regional permits, and individual permits. And in all three of those buckets, the water boards must include findings in those planning and permitting documents that lay out a concise summary of the anticipated water quality impact in disadvantaged or tribal communities as a result of planned or permitted activity or facility, and a summary of the environmental justice concerns within the scope of the water board's authority that have been raised to the boards in connection with that activity. And two, identification of measures that are available and within the scope of the water board's authority that address those impacts. Those are the findings that the boards now will need to make when they're adopting plans, policies, and permits. There are some exceptions. Generally, the findings are required without getting into the weeds. The findings are required only when a plan, policy, or permit does not require immediate compliance with water quality standards. So if the permit has a time schedule built into it for compliance, or it has a variance built into it. And there's specific types of permits that are excluded, like 401 certifications, for example, do not require findings. But by and large, a large set of the activities that you currently engage in will come to you with draft findings, and you will have to make those findings. There's a role again for the Office of Chief Counsel here. We've assigned a couple of attorneys to work on guidance to staff, all of your staff, on what these findings the content and scope of these findings, what they should entail, what types of information staff should be considering. And our goal is to get that guidance out to staff before the provisions become effective. I think that's all I wanted to say, unless Michael or Jennifer wanted to add anything, and we're obviously happy to get questions on it.
Yeah, I'll just say this is all of you, along with the state water board members and the entire racial equity team, have been doing so much over the last few years to advance our racial equity initiatives between the resolutions adopted by the various boards and now the development of the action plan. And a core tenet of all of that is recentering so much of the water board's programmatic work with an equity lens. And there's a lot of alignment. The legislation's not perfectly aligned with that initiative, but there's a lot of opportunity for us to double dip, if you will, with some of the efforts. One of the things that's going to be, really important is, like a lot of legislation, it's sort of an all things to all people approach, and it doesn't require as much as some of the folks would like it to, although they will continue to press those issues before the water boards. And just as with the racial equity issues, it doesn't do a lot to reset some of the structural, foundational world in which we operate, both from a legal perspective and from a practical perspective. So it's going to require a lot of thoughtful work by your staff and close coordination with legal staff to make sure that we're running all the right traps as we carry out both the responsibilities of 2108 as well as our racial equity initiatives. And with that, we have left plenty of time for questions from you all. So hopefully you've had your thinking caps on. And Joaquin, I don't know if we've got some coming in that way.
Nothing that's come in written, but I will say in response, written questions.
Everyone's afraid of public records.
Yeah, I know. Actually, we won't talk about records retention for this Q&A, but at least the list here. I mean, anything from folks in person. Norma, please. And I will note, though, on my poll question on what folks would like to see over this next year and or for WQCC, there was mention again of our racial equity work. I know it's one thing we covered quite a bit in the last WQCC. It was a strong text for all of our discussions here, but wasn't part of a specific panel. So following up on some of that, maybe even doing a quick memo, because there is a lot happening with the recent action plan, the hearing before the board. We'll try to summarize that, even coming out of this WQCC, since we didn't have as explicit a panel. So just want to note that. Norma.
Yes, this is for Michael. And I was just wondering, and we talked about emails and sending of emails, and it's critical to be using our water board email addresses. But with phones, all of us use our personal phones. And then we also text utilizing those personal phones. So I just wanted to get your advice on texts that we do make. And also, because we are using our personal phones, if there is some type of request to see the calls that we have made, is it going to be required for us to give up our personal phones for those types of inquiries?
Great questions, Norma. So a few different things. First of all, let me clarify, with using the personal phones and using the water board's email accounts, not only do we retain, but it will also push them off your phones. So from the email perspective, at least, the records retention policies are enforced on your own phones, your own personal devices. So for emails, that's great. You can use them. You don't have to worry about the searches. For purposes of phone calls and otherwise, if there are phone calls being taken on the personal devices, and I recognize for the regional board members, that happens a lot, a well-formed Public Records Act request will require at least the attorney or whomever's handling the request to reach out to you to determine, and typically it will be, have you received any phone calls from this person or this individual? Typically, we can do the request and then rely on whatever records you might have. It might involve taking a screenshot of the call log, and we would redact out non-work related phone numbers, for example. But they are potentially disclosable. I don't know if anyone's encountered it yet. One thing that has happened recently, and for the tech savvy EOs, have you all made Teams audio available to your board members? Okay, we might look into that, because one of the things that's been happening across the water board writ large is that all of the employees have moved to a phone system that is not based on sort of plain old telephone standards, POTS. It's based on internet telephony, and so all of our phone calls are actually handled through the Teams app on our phones or on our computers. And one way we might be able to handle a lot of that is to transition the regional board members. The state board members have already done this transition over to Teams audio. Teams also has a messaging feature, which allows us to enforce retention schedules. And so, it becomes a vehicle. One of your questions was text messages, and I'll touch that in just a second. But we may be able to help there. Now, the one thing I recognize too is then it becomes another phone number for you on top of another email address, and we already had some challenges. But that is something we can certainly explore for the individual members who may be interested in it, because it will offload some of the burden from you all. And it will let you message with your executive officer or staff at the water boards through an enforced retention schedule, and you wouldn't have to worry about the text messages, which are the next issue. Text messages are also discoverable. We have guidance. It's in the board member packet, but I'll emphasize it again. In general, text message should not be used for substantive discussions, but instead, please check your water board email, or can we have a quick phone call? The types of records that are transitory in nature and generally do not need to be retained and managed through a records retention schedule. But again, if we get a formed request, we will ask if you have any text messages that respond to the particular request. And then we have a process where we basically rely most of the time on screen captures. If it's a personal device, we'll redact out any personal information, or if it's interleaved with other messages, we'll make sure that that's not produced. But yep, any electronic detritus that has waterboard, indicia of waterboard work on it is potentially a record that could have to be produced. And we really have, with the transition on the emails, potentially with deploying, and I've got to confer with DIT and then figure out who would actually be interested in it. These other technologies, we are trying to make it easier for you all. Yeah, Eric.
But do you personally delete text strings once a week? With text, I know things never actually go away, but if you go through your text periodically, let's say once a week, and delete text strings, what do you do about what would OCC do about that?
So what our existing guidance, Patrick's going to be our enforcer. No, our existing guidance on if you end up with a substantive text message, and this is true for all staff as well as for the board members and regional board members, if there's a substantive conversation that's occurring via text, and if it's the sort of thing that it occurred on email and you would have to retain it consistent with the retention schedules, for example, if you were to have a discussion with a board member about how to resolve a particular issue in an ongoing proceeding and it's an exchange that's going back and forth, that's the sort of record we would retain if it was in a memo format or an email format, and we would put it in the administrative record, whatever the relevant retention schedule is for that particular decision process. If you do that via text, the expectation is that you will snapshot it and get a copy into the correct record series. Now that's a lot and I don't expect board members to do that or think about it, but that's why the guidance is text messages really should only be used for those sort of transient concepts like check your email, we need to talk, I heard from so-and-so, can you please call them? Those sorts of items. But if you're, and again, it's fine for you to go ahead and delete those off on a regular basis. I strongly encourage you to delete off those transitory ones, but if it's something that actually is memorializing, reach out to one of the attorneys. Should we snapshot this? And then where should we put it? SharePoint site, put it into an email. We've done that before, just so that then it goes through the regular retentions process. All this technology is wonderful, but it's also a curse in so many different ways.
Yeah, or any of us on the number of times we have.
Explain TikTok to me, or Joaquin, one of you does.
Or just ask any of us on the number of times we have to authenticate any given day or week right now. But anyway, I will actually put a plug for Teams because I so very rarely do, so may as well be able to do that when you can. The transition to having calls on the Teams app has been helpful, especially for me, where I especially don't like keeping around two devices, and so being able to compartmentalize into the app calls now as well is very helpful. So that you have another. But the reason, we had desk lines, and everyone with a desk line was basically converted over, it seems. So regional board members, we should really figure that out and offer it as a service because it really does help. You're able to just provide that one number and it comes to one device. Other questions?
Celeste.
This is a public service announcement.
Oh, here, please do get $5 over to Meredith at any moment if you would like to make sure and contribute your share. Thank you for emphasizing the public announcement around the dollars for food. Thank you, everyone. Anything else? Questions? Looking for folks, because otherwise we're about 30 minutes early on our agenda right now. I'll look at the app really quick. If Michael, you have any other
I'll
thoughts?
just filibuster to say, and I say it at every WQCC, thank you all so much. I mean, especially listening to the attorneys, and I have wonderful, and Mel and Jennifer are terrific. The regional board attorneys that you all have are terrific. What you step into when you accept the appointments, and then sit up at that dais once a month, if not more often. There's nothing else like it, but it comes with just incredible burdens. You're learning some of you are not trained attorneys, and you're forced to learn a body of law, and you're learning from engineers and environmental scientists areas that may not come naturally to you. And you get up there and you volunteer your time, and you wade through complex technical, legal, policy issues. You don't get a lot of praise from the people who come up, because half the time you can't give them everything they want. Sometimes you can. And it's just a remarkable public service you all do. And so I'm glad so many of you were able to make it in person. I appreciate those of you. Jim's been the one that's diligently kept his phone on his screen on the whole time, who have sat through all of this. WQCC is a wonderful experience, but I cannot thank you enough for the tremendous public service you all provide, because it really is at times a thankless job, but I think you all find it can be a really rewarding job too. So thanks.
Back at you, Michael. We wouldn't. Please. We're in good hands, and really appreciative of just the great care that OCC continues to provide for all the board members in our decision-making space. So thank you. That brings us to a little more of Jane, please.
Can we just acknowledge you?
No.
Your facilitation, I really appreciate it. All the board members here, really thank you.
Thank you for that. Thanks. Thanks. Let's collectively give ourselves some thanks. It has been a remarkable 2 days. It's been a remarkable couple of years here, a few years, and will continue to be for all of us. And so let's keep this discussion going. It is a once a year moment that we all collectively gather, but the pace and scale of all these discussions will necessitate that we actually kind of iterate a little quicker and sooner over the next year around some of these discussions, especially around access to drinking water and racial equity and all the things that we weren't able to jam into these 2 days, but are such a critical component of all the work that we know we're all collectively doing. So thank you for your just incredible service. I am fortunate to be a public servant amongst incredible public servants, and it means a lot. So travel safe. We have a little extra time, so mingle about, connect, share information, and we'll all be connecting very soon. I hear now of looking to Meredith. Meredith, can I close this out officially? Officially bring this yearly meeting of the Water Quality Coordinating Committee meeting to an end. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you guys soon.
I've known about it, but it's like